Пришло время. Я вижу твое желание. Твоя цель здесь. Иди ко мне. Путь завершен, человек. Иди ко мне.
Atmosphere. This is the term that I hear most often when listening about Stalker. And true enough, the team at GSC Game World has built something as memorable as it is gloomy. But I find myself thinking about the additional layer of bleakness which my friends and I felt while playing the game, inseparable from our unique experience, that is life during the twilight of communism. The system of fantastical ambitions and grandiose illusions sustained through mass murder, brute force and brainwashing came to an end, and those of us who experienced the ruin it left behind understood deeply the dread of abandoned and broken industrial complexes. We felt every heartbeat of each stalker brave enough to explore the tunnels and bunkers which ran deep like a sinister bloodstream of our societies, having done it ourselves in our childish curiosity and stupidity. We knew how it felt to be pressured by forces beyond our control but financed by the sweat of our brows. We knew what it meant to have your state as your enemy and to be powerless to do anything about it. In this sense, Stalker came as catharsis, an emotional release which perfectly captured the pressure of scattered thoughts and insecurities centered around the nature of the system we were finally freed from. And through this process, it managed to expand on the topic, introducing even wider existential questions on meaning and human nature, on our place in the world around us. It combined deep symbolism with sometimes clear, sometimes vague references to phenomenal pieces of art or thought. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy this journey through the hidden depths of Stalker. The first parallel anyone will draw naturally leads to the movie of the same name created by Andrei Tarkovsky, not only because of the title but also in relation to the concept of the zone. However, this idea does not originate from the work of the Russian cinematic giant, but from the equally magnificent written work of Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, the novel Roadside Picnic. The Strugatskys also contributed to the screenplay for the film. What connects these pieces of art, but is also present in the game, albeit less overtly, is the exploration of meaning, self-awareness, and humanity's place in the universe, although with certain differences. In that regard, I'd say that the film focuses on the individual's role in the world around him and his relationship with personal desires and the purpose forged through the struggle for their fulfillment. The book, on the other hand, offers a more explicit anti-anthropocentrism epitomized by Dr. Pillman's paradigm, which aligns with the novel's title. Humanity's insignificance compared to the potential intelligence inhabiting the vastness of the cosmos, coupled with our inability to decipher its nature, customs, or technology, is intertwined with the individual's incapacity to provide a meaningful answer to the question of their own nature, or to understand and accept the logic of the human societies of which he is an integral part, no matter how alienated he might feel. Thus, the novel is a blend of anti-humanism and epistemological despair, or at least anxiety, facing the unfathomable depth of the universe. The game, however, takes this a step further by introducing two additional concepts into its narrative: the monolith and the noosphere. This expands the story beyond what has previously been covered in analysis of the game, at least as far as I am aware. Here, we also find influences from 2001, A Space Odyssey, the ideas of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, Vladimir Vernadsky, and Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the content of the novel The Doomed City, and the interpretations of the history and character of the Soviet Union and communism in general. Let us delve into this thesis. The first part of the original Stalker trilogy begins with the awakening of the protagonist, who had been unconscious and transported in a death truck to an unknown location. The protagonist suffers from amnesia, unaware of his origin, name, or the events that led him there. The only clue he possesses is a message on his PDA: kill Strela. A significant portion of the game's activities is therefore directed at uncovering the truth about himself, his team, and the nature and origin of his mission. This setup immediately confronts the player with profound questions which are disguised as contingent by using amnesia as a narrative device, but are in fact fundamental and therefore unavoidable. Who am I? Where have I ended up? How did I get here? What am I striving for? Is there a place for me in this twisted world of omnipresent death and inexplicable phenomenon that nonetheless has its own allure? However, the story soon introduces the concept of the Wish Granter, a mystical entity located at the center of the zone, said to be capable of granting any desire to those who manage to reach it. Thus, before the protagonist finds the answers to the fundamental questions about himself, he becomes captivated by the notion of winning through discovering this extraordinary phenomenon. But how can someone with no understanding of who or what he is know what his deepest desires truly are? Here, the game confronts players with the following dichotomy: pursue self-discovery or chase the fulfillment of desires. It is, of course, easy for us today to point to what the canonical resolution is, but when the game was first released, at a time when the internet was far less accessible, players had to resist the many cues leading them towards missions culminating in the discovery of the Wish Granter as the endpoint. This is evident in the way these missions appear earlier than those guiding players towards the encounters with the guide, and then the Doctor, whose insights are critical for understanding the true nature of this mystical entity. To make things more intriguing and confusing, the encounter with the guide itself is presented without voice acting, which could easily mislead players into thinking it's an optional task meant for gathering experience and resources, rather than being essential to the story's progression. I firmly insist, without the ability to Google the solution, tasks that uncover the essence of the plot weren't immediately obvious and required a longer path, a path of questioning the dominant narrative, interacting with seemingly unimportant NPCs, resisting the urge to rush to the zone's center to collect the abundant artifacts, rejecting the alignment with any single faction's worldview, and even revisiting previously explored locations to gain deeper insights. This creates a simulation of life's challenges, inevitably faced by reflective individuals. The concept of the Wish Granter itself is presented in a specific form. From the beginning, we are told it is a monolith, while the room fulfilled this role in the movie and the Golden Sphere in the book. For this reason, I believe it's necessary to include 2001: A Space Odyssey in the interpretation of the game's content, as it offers the clearest parallel to a monolith of unknown origin that plays a fundamental role in humanity's evolution. This idea might seem far-fetched to someone familiar with the material, as the mere use of a monolith in both narratives does not in itself justify a connection. One could jokingly argue that the mere existence of humans in Stalker parallels the existence of humans in 2001: A Space Odyssey. However, despite the tongue-in-cheek nature of such a remark, I aim to demonstrate that the connection is present and profound. For those interested in more superficial but obvious points of contact, I would highlight the existence of Stalker's project documentation, version 1.4 from April 2002, in which the monolith is referred to as the Black Monolith, an entity of extraterrestrial origin created billions of years ago by unknown beings. Its formation predates the appearance of the first bacteria, and its role was to control life on Earth. Essentially, it served as an evolutionary module tasked with the development of a race of superconscious, immortal beings. This draws an unmistakable parallel to 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the Black Monolith, also of unknown origin, plays a fundamental role in the evolution of our primate relatives. It enables one group to use tools both for constructive and destructive purposes, and to gradually pass this knowledge on to subsequent generations. The evolutionary nature of this is most famously illustrated by the iconic transition from the shot of a bone being thrown into the air to the shot of a spaceship floating in the void of space. This sequence is perhaps the best-known example of what Russian film theory refers to as intellectual montage, which highlights the nature of tools as fundamentally unchanging despite undeniable technological advancements. Survival and expansion therefore remain constants. These same principles are fundamental in the world of Stalker. They apply not only to humanity but also to the animal kingdom, individual factions, scientific knowledge, and even the zone itself. The monolith in Stalker, while distinct from its original concept, plays a tripartite symbolic role that directly ties into the themes underpinning the game's narrative. The first one is the search for meaning. The monolith embodies knowledge, power, and essence that transcend the capabilities of humanity. It offers comfort, hope, and even a tangible goal against the torment of constant searching for truth, or at least so the stalkers believe. The second one is the evolutionary pinnacle, the Omega Point. This is tied to the concept introduced by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, directly connected to the idea of the noosphere, which only the most dedicated players encounter. The noosphere speaks of an inevitable evolutionary moment when the entire universe becomes unified. The third aspect pertains to the issue of epistemological arrogance. Here, the monolith, both mesmerizing and forewarning, dominates the epicenter of one of the greatest catastrophes of the past, namely the 1986 meltdown of nuclear reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl power plant. At the same time, it serves as the focal point of the greatest disaster of the future within the fantasy world of the video game and from the perspective of the time in which it was created, namely the second calamity of unknown origin and the emergence of the zone in 2006. This finally brings us to a deeper point of connection with 2001: A Space Odyssey, one that is not as immediately graspable as the previous one. In line with the three symbolic roles that Monolith plays in Stalker, we can also identify three themes the film explores. We have already touched upon the first, the question of evolution. It is quite apparent that the apes experience acceleration in the evolutionary process after encountering the monolith. However, what remains unclear is the nature of the monolith's influence. Is it a module designed to direct evolution, or is it a catalyst whose presence merely amplifies the natural curiosity of humanity's ancestors, leading to an expansion of consciousness through the emergence of abstract thought? The movie leaves this ambiguous. Be that as it may, perhaps the most striking characteristic of our species is precisely its capacity for abstract reasoning and communication in terms that are not empirically discernible. In this regard, we do not need to invoke a monotheistic God in the argument. Euclidean geometry suffices with its straight lines and triangles. Mother Nature does not produce such forms, no matter how much natural phenomena may seem to resemble them. They represent extraordinarily useful abstractions that, while absent in reality, at least in the conventional sense of that word, represent a tangible embodiment of the specific evolutionary path taken by our species. The interaction between the apes and the monolith clearly demonstrates that its straight lines, so strikingly different from the surrounding natural world, are a characteristic that captivates them. Although the game abandons the concept of the black monolith, it later introduces the idea of the noosphere, suggesting that the question of the evolutionary process is still present, albeit in a different form. In this sense, Stalker does not address the origins of this process, as the film does in the ways described above, but rather its nature and outcomes. Nonetheless, the fundamental question persists: is this process spontaneous or constructed? In this context, the monolith serves as the physical manifestation of a divine endpoint, a point of unification for the entire universe. But more on that later. Returning to Stanley Kubrick's cinematic masterpiece, we encounter the second key theme, the question of cognition. But it is important to note that this term can conceal a dual meaning. The first pertains to the perception of things as they are, while the second involves the sense of meaning attributed to or discovered within them. The latter is quite evident in the film, where the apes do not interact with the black rectangular object directly. Rather, through their behavior, we observe a process of deification in which the monolith as a physical object gradually transforms into the monolith as an idea and a source of meaning. Even though its straight lines attest to an artificial origin and its blackness precludes deeper understanding, it is its very presence that provides faith and meaning, serving as the driving force behind a cognitive process that translates into capacity for action. That blackness, offering no comprehensible explanation or discernible information, is simultaneously a depth, a mirror to the vast expanses of space, and the potential that captivates. The film draws us into this type of perception as well, leaving us with boundless interpretive space by refusing to address the monolith's nature or origin. This, I believe, is where the power of narrative centered on the extraterrestrial or the horrific often lies. When such content refrains from visually depicting intelligent beings or evil, or offers them only in highly abstract approximations, it taps into a potent allure. Potential without form, pure possibility is what fascinates and terrifies. The same can be said of ideas of an omnipotent deity, boundless and unconfined by the narrow categories of human thought and language. Precisely for this reason, such a deity serves as a source of comfort for many. Its existence relieves us of the burden of incomprehensibility, which, alongside its sweet fruits, also offers the torment of facing questions far too complex for an entire species, let alone an individual. The agony of staring into the void, into that blackness which ultimately consumes us in death, is easier to bear or even to forget when meaning is entrusted to another, one for whom we believe that, in his grandeur, has a plan even for us. But as many have long demonstrated, most notably Dostoevsky, who brought this idea to literary perfection, earthly interpretations of meaning are swiftly shaped by the arrival of the Grand Inquisitor. This figure, as an interpreter and an intermediary, establishes the rules for experiencing meaning and provides a sense of security, though inevitably at the cost of freedom. Stalker, in this regard, offers us the monolith faction as the extreme endpoint of this path. A group of brainwashed individuals in direct communication with an allegedly divine authority that speaks to them directly within their minds. This authority grants them meaning but demands in return that they fanatically guard its secrets. Amidst the sea of factionalism ultimately rooted in the same foundation of shared profane meanings and ideas about what the zone is, and more importantly how one ought to behave within it, the monolith faction stands as the most powerful and with most dedicated warriors, even as their minds wander through a limbo devoid of independent thought. Yet when the voice of their master falls silent and this synthetic sense of meaning evaporates, each soul is left alone in the open, battered by winds, rain, and cold.
А вчера вода с неба. Мокро. Холодно. Мне холодно.
This brings us to the final question, the question of distinction. This does not only concern the problem of factional divisions, but more fundamentally the possibility of separating the elements of empirical reality contrasted with our ambitions and our overestimation of that ability. To explore this, we must return to the depiction in the movie. Unlike the apes who approach the monolith cautiously and submissively, one later scene shows their descendants, clad in spacesuits, exuding a certain arrogance of a rational being that has overcome mysticism. They find meaning in their cognitive abilities and even take pride in them. This scene illustrates the earlier mentioned aspect of cognition, the perception of things as they are. The astronauts' approach to the monolith on the moon is casual, playful, and even reckless, stemming from the belief that what their senses and cognitive capacities can access is all there is to know, or at least the majority of it. The price for this, though minor, becomes evident when, instead of taking a photograph with this extraordinary object, they are met with a piercing noise in their heads, resulting in collective fainting. Later on, we also see the monolith attempting to communicate with one of the researchers, offering him a glimpse of its wonders, which, due to his and our limited sensory capacities, manifest as a psychedelic play of colors and shapes, devoid of meaning, or rather filled with meaning beyond our grasp. However, what I find most fascinating is the contrast between the blackness of the monolith and the blackness of space. This serves as a visual device employed by the filmmaker, showing us the enigmatic entity drifting through cosmos. Its contours briefly become recognizable under flashes of light, only to dissolve again into the void of the universe. This brings us to two problems of distinction. First, in our analytical and categorizing zeal, built on the idea of identifying distinct units within a broader system and dissecting them to construct a picture of the whole based on the understanding of its components, how do we reconcile with the fact that in complex systems such distinctions are often impossible? Reality does not care for the categorical framework we use to describe it. Second, even if we succeed in separating these elements, How do we comprehend their depth, which far exceeds our expectations based on the perceived dimensions of the problem or phenomenon? Symbolically, this is reflected in the astronaut's immersion into the incomprehensible meaning offered by the monolith. On its own, this dilemma could remain within the realm of epistemology and methodology, refining itself over years of spontaneous intellectual development, whether scientific, artistic, or philosophical. However, the issue rises from the constant pressure to convert knowledge into action. In its milder form, this leads to the emergence of problems. In its more severe form, it results in catastrophes at points where empirical reality exceeds the boundaries of the categorical tools we use to engage with it. Because of that, at this juncture we can establish a connection to the most striking theme of Stalker, the monolith as the epicenter of catastrophe, a monument to epistemological arrogance. This in turn leads us to the earlier mentioned influence of interpreting Soviet history and the character of communism more broadly, which, as we will see, is deeply embedded in the narrative of this video game. The symbolism is evident and potent, linking the ruined reactor of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, a factual monument to the depth of the Soviet Union's fall, and the failure of the communist ideal of planned construction of reality, with the monolith as a virtual monument or lure. This creation of self-proclaimed saviors, wielding a blend of utopian ambition, secrecy, and the power granted to them by a centrally planned system, resulted in the creation of the Zone. Their vision of a just world through a series of unintended consequences transformed into a realm of death, anomalies, lies, divisions, night-stalking monsters, and ultimately culminated in the crowning deceit embodied by the monolith. This theme also resonates with the film Stalker, where we witness the professor and the writer attempt to destroy the room, accompanied by a monologue reflecting on the nature of the need to save the world and the arrogance of those who assume the role of savior. There's no joking around with Andrei Tarkovsky, and it becomes clear that this question permeates Russian culture, reaching its peak in grappling with the falsification of reality and the obligation to participate in it with a smile, a duty mercilessly imposed by Soviet authorities. That said, these themes deserve deeper exploration. However, before we proceed, I must ask the viewer for patience. The parallels I've drawn with 2001: A Space Odyssey are not made lightly, and the fact that this film has so far served as the primary reference point does not mean that content more directly connected to the game will not emerge. All will come in due time. With that said, let us proceed step by step.
That's the Zone for you. Come back with a swag, a miracle. Come back alive, success. Come back with a patrol bullet in your ass, good luck. And everything else? That's fate.
The first question that likely comes to mind when delving into this content is, why would anyone in their right mind enter the Zone? Is it possible that earthly delights possess such an irresistible allure that we are willing to risk our lives and leave our loved ones behind for the mere chance of experiencing them? Are we truly prepared to extract artifacts from the Zone, objects we do not understand and which could potentially decimate vast swaths of humanity? Are we willing to endure the consequences of genetic alterations and the mutilation of our offspring? Are we ready to risk aimlessly wandering through the desolate landscapes of the exclusion zone, zombified, our minds destroyed by the brain scorcher? Stalker, however, places little value on cheap moralizing or poetic rapture. The game faces life in all its tragedy. It does not shy away from the suffocating questions of personal anguish and disorientation, nor from the insignificance of the human race in the face of the relentless jaws of empirical reality. It understands the cost of existence and the paradoxes that fill each of our lives. It knows that many fathers and husbands will not return, and that the price of the role they played, however briefly, often negates those roles entirely. For a stalker to be a father, he must ensure his family's survival.
И как там мои? Что там у них? Знать бы.
Yet, to ensure survival, he must expose himself to all manner of risks, potentially losing his sanity or life in the process, thereby erasing his parental role altogether.
Еще немного и домой. Вот
For many, reality offers no choice between entering or avoiding the zone, only certain options once inside. Does this sound absurd? Let us return to Road to Vegan Pier mentioned in the video on Prince Arthas and Warcraft. Let us recall the broken backs and empty stairs lost in despair and squalor, which nonetheless constitute life. Let us remember that what adds an additional layer of darkness to this already grim view of existence is the fact that, thanks to those broken backs, our lives are blessed with the marvels of technology. At the foundation of the Industrial Revolution and our lives lie countless masses of workers and peasants, which in no way denies or diminishes the role of other social strata. Similarly, despite all the dangers, the expanses of the zone remain filled with countless actors whose motivations cannot simply be reduced to greed or blindness to consequences, whether for themselves, their loved ones, or the broader community. Thus, the game does not pass judgment on the character of those who have settled there. Instead, it observes their ambitions, reasons, thoughts, fears, and fates with complete neutrality. Talkers, traders, doctors, bandits, and scientists are simply a fact, part of a complex ecosystem, just like pseudo-dogs, boars, or chimeras. They are individuals making do with what they have, teaming up, killing, sharing, dying, creating, deceiving, dreaming, stealing, and grieving. Together, they weave the fabric of what we call humanity, blindly groping in the darkness, seeking a path forward on the relentless road of evolution, survival, and expansion. This abundance of actors is primary mechanism through which life operates. In the chaotic activity of the masses, in the struggle and jostling for better positions, in the ruthless clash of blocks of living matter that irresistibly expand and forcefully penetrate one another, individual capacities are pushed to their limits, and only the most capable rise to the top. Yet, even the most capable individual remains largely insignificant, reduced to the level of a guinea pig that life, metaphorically speaking, uses to test for favorable possibilities or paths forward. The actor we see as a hero is, to life, nothing more than a discarded cog used to probe for anomalies along the way. Individual fates may thus be tragic, thrilling, grim, or awe-inspiring, but the cumulative consequence of all these tests of possibility is the progress and expansion of life. The law of large numbers works inexorably, life multiplies boundlessly, and through countless trials finds its way forward. Yet, in our fascination with our own existence and our individualistic worldview, we lose sight of this. We construct narratives of courageous lives, of the hero, of the one, the first, the greatest. Finding meaning in such constructs, we fall into traps of our own making. That is why, at what appears to be the ultimate destination of the blind groping in the dark, the game presents a dazzling illusion that beckons and promises.
Вознагражден будет только один.
There can be only one. This is the message in which many find meaning, but it is also the bait that leads to their demise. We will return later to the question of this evolutionary march, but for now let us turn to the actors that populate the world of the zone. While most NPCs do not provide deeper insights into their individual motives, there are those who serve as illustrative examples. The first such character is Sidorovich, a trader who appears in both Shadow of Chernobyl and Clear Sky. He is a seasoned figure, one of the first to enter the zone, but who chose the role of a trader due to his physical condition and character. He deemed himself unfit for the combat required to penetrate deep into the zone, believing he would not last long. However, precisely because of this decision, he becomes a pivotal node in the intricate trading network that connects the outside world to the zone via intermediaries in the military and contacts among stalkers. His motivation, revealed right from the start, is tied to his ambition to establish a trade route to the center of the zone, which he views merely as an opportunity for lucrative ventures. Sidorovich does not attribute any mystique to the center, nor does he dwell on interpretations of its nature or the zone as a whole. He is a pragmatic man, driven by material gain, but an irreplaceable element in the chain that brings resources into the zone and takes them out. He supplied stalkers with weapons, medicine, uniforms, and other equipment, while also acting as a provider and benefactor for representatives of the outside world: jewelers, doctors, security structures, and even tourists. Love him or hate him, he is an integral part of the zone's complex social fabric, dedicated not only to commerce but also to stabilizing relations between the military controlling the cordon and the stalkers dwelling on the zone's outskirts. His efforts contribute to an increase in the expected lifespan within an environment fraught with danger. Another intriguing individual is Bies, an experienced stalker who operates with his team in the area called Garbage. He entered the zone fleeing the law as he was wanted for murder and causing grievous bodily harm. Interestingly enough, his actions stemmed from a desire to avenge a friend who had been brutally beaten and hospitalized. Bies sees himself and his crew as a group of avengers or enforcers of justice, though of course no one officially acknowledges them as such. Interestingly, this stalker strives to maintain order primarily by fighting bandits, yet he refuses to align himself with duty due to their ties with Ukrainian authorities and his fear of one day waking up in prison. Although ruthless towards bandits, Bies tries to act fairly toward honest folk, insisting that his motivations lie within the realm of morality. He believes that, especially in the harsh conditions of the zone, one must behave as a human being, selflessly. Thus, a wanted criminal in the outside world, through his charisma, strength, and leadership skills, manages to organize the scattered individual capacities of stalkers unaffiliated with factions. He avoids grand narratives and adheres to the smallest common denominator, the fight against scum. In doing so, he forms a protective barrier against the murderers, thugs, and lowlifes that roam the zone, preying on loners in moments of vulnerability and robbing them of their hard-earned money and artifacts. Like Sidorovich, Bies contributes to increasing the life expectancy of those who value the lives and efforts of others, those who, to paraphrase, earn their bread by the sweat of their brow. Without delving into excessive detail, it is clear that this world is teeming with actors who have traversed different developmental paths, and their presence in the zone cannot simply be dismissed as a reflection of greed, madness, or something else. The very term stalker neither is nor can be a simple derogation. It refers to
desperate young men who, despite the grave risks, sneak into the zone and smuggle out whatever they find. It's quite the new career.
Although this might seem reckless to some, I would add that it's seemingly reckless because this quality is precisely what propels them forward, positioning them as the vanguard of humanity, clearing a path through uncharted and terrifying terrains, and paving the way for the rest of community to tread the path of survival more gradually. A clear parallel in our reality can be drawn with the fates of seafarers who, unaware of what lay ahead and often lacking even the conceptual framework to sketch the bounds of the possible, set out into the open sea. They were driven by the desire for discovery, the thirst for profit, or the need to escape the law. Just imagine the strength of the motivations that made them ready to battle storms, hunger, scurvy, scorching suns, disease, thirst, unknown beasts, freezing winters, or the risk of dismemberment during mutinies or combat. And now imagine enduring all this not in the 19th but in the 15th century, inspired by the visionary statement of someone who claims that the earth might not be flat after all, while you are armed with a conceptual framework that places a bottomless abyss at the edges of the terrestrial. This is therefore an extremely scalable profession where the range of possibilities stretches between the actor's death in the most excruciating circumstances and unimaginable gains, be they material, like wealth, intellectual, like discovery and knowledge, or judicial, like an escape from punishment to freedom. It is truly difficult to fathom this. Now the zone amplifies this scale to the extreme, introducing the notion that an actor's death is no longer the worst possible outcome. Instead, it is the potential destruction of humanity as a whole, while the best-case scenario envisions an indescribable flourishing of life and understanding. If we turn again to the book, we will illuminate two important questions aligned with the previously mentioned themes of meaning and understanding. These are the questions of alienation, which can also serve as an element explaining the motivation described in the example of the sailors, and the question of the relationship between empiricism and insight. To illustrate the first, we can turn to a conversation between Aloysius McNaugh, an agent of the Bureau of Immigration, and Rederick Schuchart, a stalker. McNaugh works on evacuating people from Harmont, a city near which the zone has appeared, and he cannot comprehend why anyone would remain in such a place. Schuchart, known for his fiery temperament, has little patience for do-gooders, and in his passionate response he combines two perspectives. Although he delivers both with equal fervor, his reflection on his own feelings reveals that the first answer is not actually a result of his own thoughts and beliefs, but rather the optimism of his colleague Kirill.
Mr. Aloysius McNaught, I say, you are absolutely right. Our little town is a hole. Always was and always will be. Except right now, I say, it's a hole into the future. And the stuff we fish out of this hole will change your whole stinking world. Life will be different, the way it should be, and no one will want for anything. That's our hole for you. There's knowledge pouring through this hole. And when we figure it out, we'll make everyone rich, and we'll fly to the stars, and we'll go wherever we want. That's the kind of hole we have here.
It seems to me that the echo of this passage is reflected in the game, among others, in the character of Professor Kruglov, who shares an enthusiasm for the opportunities the zone offers, even though he is fully aware of its dangers. Precisely because of such a view of the zone, Kruglov harbors hostility toward both duty and freedom. Turning back, we see that, on the other hand, what Rederick truly believes and feels is encapsulated in the following passage.
And you know the amazing thing? I'm telling him this, and I completely believe in what I'm saying. And our zone, the evil bitch, the murderess, is at that moment 100 times dearer to me than all their Europes and Africas. And I'm not even drunk yet. I simply imagine for a moment how I'd come home, strung out after work in a herd of like-minded drones. How I'd get squashed on all sides in their subway. How I'd become jaded and weary of life.
Another confirmation of the sincerity of these thoughts comes at the very end of the novel, where the following reflections rush through his mind.
Man is born in order to think. There he is, Kirill, finally. Except that I don't believe that. I've never believed it, and I still don't believe it. And what man is born for? I have no idea. He's born, that's all. Scrapes by as best he can. Let us all be healthy, and let them all go to hell. Who's us? Who's them? I don't understand a thing. If I'm happy, Burbridge is unhappy. If Burbridge is happy, Four Eyes is unhappy. If Raspy is happy, everyone else is unhappy, and Raspy himself is unhappy, except he, the idiot, imagines that he'll be able to wriggle out of it somehow. My lord, it's a mess, a mess. My entire life I've been at war with Captain Quarterblad, and his whole life he's been at war with Raspy, and all he's ever wanted from me, the blockhead, was one thing, that I stop being a stalker. But how do I stop being a stalker when I have a family to feed? Get a job, and I don't want to work for you. Your work makes me want to puke, you understand. If a man has a job, then he's always working for someone else. He's a slave, nothing more. And I've always wanted to be my own boss, my own man, so that I don't have to give a damn about anyone else, about their gloom and their boredom.
These two distinct answers reflect what accompanies Rederick throughout the entire novel: the tentative optimism of others and the sense of alienation or meaningless he personally wrestles with. This optimism is embodied in the novel by the scientist Kirill and the stalker Arthur. For Kirill, it stems from his enthusiastic curiosity about the possibilities that a living experiment like the Zone offers, while for Arthur it arises from the uncorrupted spirit of a young man eager for positive change for everyone, though still too inexperienced to grasp the naivety and banality of his worldview. Although Rederick has long since been disillusioned with the world, he nonetheless develops a certain sympathy for both. However, in both cases, the journey to seek artifacts ends in death, bringing Red back to grim reality and solidifying his animosity toward optimism. Yet, as we see throughout the rest of the novel, whose narrative spans significant time intervals, even though death and loss remain constants, humanity continues to produce optimists, and life, through trial and error, finds a way. By the end of the book, we learn that the process of robotizing the stalker profession is well underway. This development ties into another constant, the sense of alienation, emptiness, despair, and meaninglessness. Those fortunate enough to have lived long enough now have the opportunity to ponder the nature of such a fate, reflecting on past struggles and the deaths of friends consumed by longing, or the question, couldn't the robotization have come sooner so that the sorrow endured would be just a bad dream and their friends could once again sit by the campfire? But then again, if it had been so, if their work had been robotized earlier, what would they have lived on? As for Schuchart, entering the zone fighting against the authorities and exposing himself to the dangers posed by anomalies serve as an imaginary cure for his afflictions, one that, as it turns out, does not yield results. Although in his reflection during the conversation with Macnaugh, he envisions himself in the context of a regular life in Europe or Africa, without desires and overcome by nausea as he rides the subway home from work, by the very end of the novel, the circle closes at the very point he sought to escape. Having endured the agony of battling anomalies, the nausea induced by his views of his own life, and finally the numbness of his powerlessness before the zone, Red stands on the brink of the golden sphere, empty and devoid of personal desires, repeating Arthur's words.
Happiness, free for everyone, and let no one be forgotten.
It becomes evident that heroic narratives, adventures, and exploits fill the imagination, motivate, inspire, and generally provide a sense of satisfaction. However, like all our great stories, they conceal more than they reveal. They rely on retroactively imposing grandeur, though it is far more likely that emptiness is the constant of human existence, articulated with greater or lesser clarity. The same thing applies to us riding tramps to work, as it does to the sailor standing before the potential of the unknown. The zone in the game makes this abundantly clear. You only need to pause by a campfire and listen to what the NPCs are saying.
Что-то не весело мне сегодня. Все кругом грустное, все некрасивые. Все течет, все поломалось, и ничего не меняется. Сегодня сидим себе спокойно, водочку кушаем, а завтра уже берется куда-то надо, материалы добывать.
Ох, и страшно на белом свете жить. И зачем я только из мамочкиного пуза вылез? И кто бы знал, как мне домой охота. Как меня прижало.
Да, настроение хуже не бывает. И гнусь кругом сплошная. Да. Вот ведь как грустно все выходит.
Viewed in this context, the poem by Arseny Tarkovsky, featured in the film but equally applicable to the book and the game, burns even more profoundly.
Now summer is gone and might never have been. In the sunshine it's warm, but there has to be more. It all came to pass, all fell into my hands, like a 5-petaled leaf, but there has to be more. Nothing evil was lost, nothing good was in vain, all ablaze with clear light, but there has to be more. Life gathered me up, safe under its wing. My luck always held, but there has to be more. Not a leaf was burned up, not a twig ever snapped. Clean as glass is the day, but there has to be more.
Let us return to the mentioned wish. This seemingly innocuous sentence actually contradicts what we observed in the previous quotations, regardless of whether it pertains to his own thoughts or those he attributes to Kirill. The desire for unearned happiness negates the need for consciousness and intellect, which are the source of both the yearning for knowledge and the meaning found in the abstractions we glorify: freedom, duty, will, honor, and so on. Alienation is an inevitable consequence of intellect, and there is no cure for it. The only question is when and to what extent this feeling will manifest. However, this sense of emptiness is precisely what motivates action aimed at changing the state of affairs, whereas happiness free for all implies an abandonment of consciousness, of the quest to uncover, and ultimately of humanity itself. From this perspective, there is no room to glorify reason, consciousness, or intellect. They are merely evolutionary tools, and it is entirely valid to question whether they are worth the inevitable suffering they bring. The Strugatskys therefore remain unrelentingly somber. As for the game, we see that the developers share this sentiment. Thus, regardless of Strelok's desire, the ultimate outcome can only be death or blindness, a negation of all prior struggles and efforts. By deciding to approach the monolith and thereby shorten the path of the quest, the player consciously abandons the harder but the only correct choice. Mystery is discarded through this surrender, yet the question remains as to whether even the alternative path can bring fulfillment, despite being, as we have said, the only correct one. Now, seeing Strelok's feelings and reactions in Call of Pripyat, we can conclude that they probably cannot. Be that as it may, for now we must move on to another topic, namely the relationship between empiricism and knowledge. In overcoming the challenges posed by work in the zone, Schuchart primarily relies on what might be called intuition or a sense of foreboding. It has been mentioned that both Kirill and Arthur meet their ends either directly in the zone or as a result of subsequent contact with an anomaly. However, what inevitably stands out is the fact that in both cases, Schuchart foresaw this outcome but was unable to explain how he knew. Lacking the categorical apparatus to label observed phenomena and interpret causal relationships, unlike Kirill, who confidently navigates terminology, Rederick simply perceives danger through what, guided by Friedrich Hayek's thought, we might call tacit knowledge. It is the knowledge that arises from accumulated empirical experience, free from theorizing. This is no trivial matter and directly ties into the nature of factional divisions in Stalker, but is equally relevant to the topic we will address later, the monolith as the culmination of epistemological arrogance. To understand it adequately, however, we must examine several quotations. Let us begin with Schuchart's reflection on the nature of Kirill's vocation. During one of their expeditions into the zone, commenting on Kirill's naming of an anomaly, Schuchart observes,
His face has become completely calm. You can see he's figured everything out. They are all like that, the eggheads. The most important thing for them is to come up with a name. Until he comes up with one, you feel really sorry for him. He looks so lost. But when he finds a label like graviconcentrate, he thinks he's figured it all out and perks right up.
This act of naming as a prerequisite for action can be interpreted in two ways. On the first level, the personal and far less intriguing one, we can speak of apprenticeship, the amusing, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous, yet undoubtedly necessary phase of life in which youth, through practice, begins to grasp the complexity of reality. During this phase, they cling tightly to their initial notions, only to later realize the limitation or impracticality of such concepts when tested against real-world experience. But the second level is the one that instills fear. It reflects the phenomenon of platonification, or, as Nassim Taleb described it, the tendency to mistake abstract, idealized representations for reality. This occurs when we favor neatly defined concepts like geometric shapes or social ideals over the messier, more complex realities they attempt to represent. Such rigid thinking can lead to overconfidence in our understanding, despite the inherent unpredictability of where and how these simplifications deviate from the truth. The challenge lies in the fact that we can identify these flaws only after they manifest, often with potentially significant consequences. Kirill is armed with terminology, educated, intelligent, and eager for knowledge, yet he is shaped within a closed space where theoretical rather than practical and thus tacit knowledge is acquired. This makes him blind to aspects of empirical reality that are not encompassed by his categorical framework. As we see in the book, what Kirill fails to perceive, deemed irrelevant from the perspective through which he views things and thus invisible to his cognitive apparatus, is precisely what, as Schuchart senses, seals his fate. On the other hand, to Schuchart as a practitioner, Kirill's apparatus likely only adds unnecessary burden. The difference lies in the fact that Rhetoric does not need to create definitions which are always inadequate, though not necessarily useless, because we are incapable of capturing all aspects of a phenomenon, neither through our senses nor especially through our terminology. Let us illustrate this with an example. Imagine a person who works with colors every day. It is unlikely he would need a lecture on the nature of blue or red. On the contrary, such a lecture would only waste his time and impose an unnecessary burden amidst his other activities. Now imagine a scholar developing a theory about his profession who seeks to make such knowledge accessible to everyone, including those who are colorblind or visually impaired. Picture a definition of blue that anyone can understand, and I mean understand in the same way we all understand ballistics. No one needs to take a course to learn how to throw stones or spears. Mother Nature has equipped us with this ability. The gravity of this issue cannot be overstated, especially when it comes to large-scale interventionist endeavors such as communism. In the world of Stalker, this manifests in attempts to control the minds of animals and humans, with people ambitious enough to believe in their own ability to influence the noosphere and create, at least ostensibly, a perfect world. As we see, unaware of the flaws in their map, the scientists of sea consciousness produce an ecological disaster that spirals beyond their control. Brothers Strugatsky are acutely aware of this problem and cleverly play with the nicknames of the characters, which starkly contrast with their professions. For instance, we learn that a surgeon is nicknamed the Butcher.
He was a very skilled and very fashionable surgeon, renowned in the medical community, not only of the city but of the state. And, of course, the reason he got mixed up with stalkers wasn't the money. Like many others, he profited from the zone by receiving swag and then applying it in his practice, by treating crippled stalkers, in the process investigating mysterious new injuries, diseases, and deformities of the human body, and by becoming famous as the first doctor on the planet to specialize in non-human illnesses of man. Although, to be honest, he also eagerly took the money.
The Butcher, like Rhetoric, is another example of a person whose worldview is built from the ground up, one rooted in practical experience and empiricism, eschewing theories and melodious terminology. His nickname serves as a warning against the ideologically negative portrayal of practitioners in contrast to the refinement and elitism of theorists. It is precisely the theorists who dream of perfection, incapable of accepting the fact that empirical phenomena cannot be neatly contained within their categorical framework. Regardless of the grandeur of the words they employ, one need only recall The Road to Wigan Pier and Orwell's critique of socialist theorists. In Orwell's own words, they are driven by a peculiar, hypertrophied sense of order, a deep discomfort with the messiness of the current state of affairs. This ultimately brings us to Strelok. Although numerous stories circulate within the zone, he is the only one for whom we know with certainty who managed to reach the Wish-Granter and, considering the canonical ending, uncover the sea consciousness. Strelok, along with a select group, serves as one of the key nodes within the network connecting the largest number of actors present in the zone, which inherently keeps him outside the factional divisions. While the YouTuber Anomalous Dugout mentions the existence of ideas to enable factional affiliation in the first game and demonstrates glitches that allow players to align with freedom, it is evident that developers ultimately chose to exclude this element. Naturally, the primary reason lives in avoiding the convoluted explanations that would have been needed to justify interactions with representatives of other clans essential to narrative progression. However, if we reflect on what was previously said about the relationship between empiricism and cognition, it becomes clear that adopting the worldview of any clan would inevitably lead to failure. By embracing the categorical apparatus and value judgments, Strelok would close his mind, hinder the gathering of information from opposing camps, waste energy on irrelevant issues and conflicts, and ultimately never come closer to understanding the zone. Yet, clans are far from irrelevant, in fact, quite the opposite. In a deadly environment, having allies, especially ones well organized into a clear and cohesive operational group, can be a key factor that separates life and death. In addition to this, the yearning to belong is one of humanity's primary drives, and extraordinary energy and strength are required in order to face the void alone. Clans and camaraderie thus provide a sense of meaning and seemingly a remedy for alienation. But that meaning ultimately stems from dogma, not from understanding. This makes Dr. Pillman's insight profoundly significant.
But the issue is that man, at least the average man, can easily overcome this need. In my opinion, the need doesn't exist at all. There's a need to understand, but that doesn't require knowledge. The God hypothesis, for example, allows you to have an unparalleled understanding of absolutely everything while knowing absolutely nothing. Give a man a highly simplified model of the world and interpret every event on the basis of this simple model. This approach requires no knowledge. A few rote formulas, plus some so-called intuition, some so-called practical acumen, and some so-called common sense.
Faced with such masterfully concise and profound reflections, one can only remain speechless. Terms we cherish, intuition, practice, reason, which I too have used up to this point, become nothing more than a flimsy shield against a storm of incomprehensible complexity hurtling towards us. How ignorant, then, is the notion that one can declare certain clans to be objectively right, as one of the more popular YouTubers, Mandalore Gaming, does when he claims this about duty. And this is not the only mistake he makes, which can be seen in his reflection on the connection between the movie, the book, and the game, stating that the only tie exists in the concept of the zone, in people breaking into it, and in the existence of something that grants wishes. Following Dr. Pillman's thoughts, this can lead us to the conclusion that he may have understood everything, and yet that he knows nothing of the game. That's why we will turn towards factional divisions and seek the answers.
Позбивались тут в стае. Ну, точно звери, по цвету шкуры. Одни как разбойничали, так и разбойничают. А другие то ли нас от зоны, то ли зону от нас охраняют. Солдаты, блин, тоже.
As was mentioned before, having friends in the zone is often the difference between life and death. Only through a coordinated effort of many does it become possible to fight off beasts, anomalies, and other stalkers. Complementing this is the fact that for most people, the very existence of a unifying narrative generates the capacity for action. Faced with a multitude of questions and uncertainties, a person often remains stuck in place, incapable of taking any action for fear of making the wrong move and suffering its consequences. Conversely, armed with more or less complex explanations that allow him to understand, following Dr. Pillman's previously described interpretation, and integrated into a broad network of like-minded individuals, a person evolves into an agent of action, finding intellectual support and moral comfort in the collective he is a part of. Open questions thus become subject to simple categorizations or moral judgments, resulting in a significant conservation of energy that would otherwise be expended. This should not be understood as a eulogy to an ideological worldview or conformity of thought, far from it. It simply speaks to the relationship between efficiency and the coordination of individual actions. In conditions of open debate and continuous questioning, decision-making and action slow down, consuming vast amounts of time, often unacceptably much from the perspective of the set objectives. It would therefore be foolish to expect such deliberation within military-type organizational units. However, factional divisions within the zone are not solely tied to survival and combat, but also extend to interpretations of its origin and nature, as well as the organization of life and interpersonal relationships within it. Here, things become radically more complicated, and efficiency comes at the expense of truth. This is directly linked to the previously mentioned problem of distinction. The necessity of translating knowledge into action implies a shift from the slow and arduous process of questioning, researching, revisiting initial assumptions, and considering alternative perspectives, to swift decision-making, shortcutting the process and relying on simplified mental maps where each element has its fixed role, leaving no room for complexity of the world. especially not when a finger is on the trigger. Different approaches to distinguishing discrete units within a complex system and interpreting their relationships evolve through the demand for action aligned with these interpretations, as well as the moral and value judgments that accompany most human activities, into the formation of distinct operational units, in this case clans. In this way, the process of dissecting reality comes back like a boomerang, leading to the dissection and fragmentation of human efforts. On the other hand, belonging not only provides a sense of security against external threats, but also gives meaning. Maps of meaning make everything comprehensible, while truth is validated by the existence of others who believe the same thing, which in turn serves as the foundation from which meaning is drawn. When framed this way, it indeed seems foolish, yet what applies to children applies to adults as well, albeit in a different form and with far more dire consequences. In this manner, the mechanism of verification is displaced from empirical reality and transferred into the realm of the intersubjective, while the refuge from the scorching gaze that demands accountability is found in the crowd of the like-minded. Many find precisely such behavior to be a source of peace of mind. However, as already mentioned, there is no escape from self-examination and alienation. Both are inevitable consequences of intellect and self-awareness. Thus, just like the previously mentioned grandiose terms such as freedom or duty, clan belonging, viewed in the abstract, does not surpass the role of a fragile shield against the abyss of the universe. And yet, the allure of the zone remains irresistible to many. Fantasies of wealth, freedom, knowledge, or duty that will be forged through interaction with it and within it exert their intoxicating effect, calling forth new seekers again and again. The yearning for meaning through the fulfillment of desires far from the supposedly corrupt or unjust everyday world burns intensely. In contrast to the dull gazes of exhausted workers on their way home, in contrast to state control and surveillance, in contrast to a meaningless life devoid of obligations, in contrast to pseudo-research work framed by templates of prejudice, fear, and academic bureaucracy, in contrast to all this stands the virgin expanse of the zone onto which we project our fantasies and dreams. Notice also the use of color in the movie Stalker. Only after breaking through the cordon do the scenes take on a natural palette, while the frames depicting the world they came from are dominated by brown, yellow, and gray. Symbolically, this contrast testifies to the depression, lifelessness, and despair of a reality drained of meaning and hope. Much like in the game, the potential of the other world, no matter how little it may be, restores the magic of existence. Still, as the wise Stalker from the beginning of this chapter observes, birds of feather flock together, and thus we must illuminate the tragedy of a rather widespread belief. Namely, in conversations with people we often hear remarks about the questionable nature of the society they are a part of. I assume we have all pondered injustices, corruption, the meaning of fighting against them, or ways in which the situation might be corrected. Yet, I doubt we have considered these questions in every decision we made, or asked ourselves how our own actions may contribute to the negative outcomes. While this could be interpreted as a lack of awareness regarding personal responsibility, I would argue that a broader phenomenon is at play. As social reality becomes increasingly complex at a rapid pace, many people experience a growing sense that their own lives are not in their hands, let alone that they have any influence over broader social developments. And yet, contrary to the idea that society is an inherently evil construct separated from us and our intentions, there is a reason why all the ideals we have ever invented ultimately become distorted. For this very reason, an escape into the idealized zone of possibilities merely recreates the same world of death, hunger, meaninglessness, and division as the one we fled from, if not something worse. Every society is a consequence of the sum of our choices, limited perceptions, prejudices, nature, weaknesses, and strengths, rather than the result of some mystical hidden forces. It is true that sea consciousness shapes the ecological environment hidden from the view of most, but it is equally true that the atrocities, looting, armed conflicts, drunkenness, and mistreatment of subordinates are all products of the social relations created by the stalkers themselves. The zone is neither merely evil nor merely an opportunity, it is our creation, not only as the tragedy of an ill-fated intrusion into the noosphere, but also as the world of social formations that inhabit it. and those shadowy players that make up C consciousness are nothing more than people of great ideals, which is why we must never forget the capacity for evil, whether conscious or unconscious, that lurks within each of us, and which no lack of awareness can ever truly justify. At this point, we can draw another parallel to the film, shedding light on the phenomenon in question. Around 1 hour and 2 minutes in, the guide begins his speech about the zone, trying to comprehend what is happening and convey his own insights to others. Reflecting on its seemingly capricious nature, explaining the shifting anomalies and the emergence of new challenges, he concludes that everything that happens depends on the people themselves. The human mind, in fact, functions as a catalyst for anomalies, or rather traps. Through their own thoughts, stalkers place obstacles in their path, not only for themselves but for others as well, and this can be seen as a metaphor for the journey through life, the search for meaning and fulfillment. After all, the protagonists remain outside the room for a reason, grappling with their own thoughts, afraid that this version of the wish granter might reveal the truth about their true nature, a truth that could be, at the very least, unsettling. And from the same perspective, we can justifiably ask, how could we possibly create a perfect world free of evil, confusion and suffering when these things live within us, poisoning our thoughts and souls? Death is a natural phenomenon, but omnipresent death and destruction in this case are the consequence of our choices, frustrations, divisions and malice. This is a perspective that the members of C consciousness have not taken into account, but neither have individual clans for that matter. Both groups see themselves as exempt from these truths as exceptional. But let us return to the question of faith and meaning, one of the three themes mentioned at the beginning. As stated, the ever-present void or sense of alienation, manifesting with varying intensity and frequency, can be partially alleviated through belonging. When unable to find fulfillment through our own intellectual and active capacities, we seek a supposed cure for this affliction in the existence of a group that carries faith. It acts as a link bridging the gap between the individual and the universe. The individual thus dissolves into an abstract collective body, drawing meaning from the narrative shared by the group, from rituals marking significant moments, and from a plan and coordinated action that partially embodies the group's unified intellectual and active capacities. This is perfectly aligned with the evolutionary path of our species, which embarked on the struggle for survival and expansion collectively, not only in terms of pack organization for survival. We clearly see this path in 2001: A Space Odyssey through the primates' interaction with the monolith. The blackness of this object, as noted, offers no information and easily fades into the cosmic abyss, yet the collective movement around it, the cautious probing and cries, are a primitive manifestation of synchronized action in the discovery of meaning, the creation of narrative and ritual, everything that makes us human. Thus, the monolith becomes part of the transcendent, the celestial, or the divine, something that belongs to us as a group. This marks the first stage in the developmental journey in seeking meaning and truth. A look at the physical manifestation of the supposedly divine, and an interpretation of its nature and how to please it, represents the starting point on the path of cognition. Meaning is perceived. However, at this point, the logic of knowledge is reversed. Information does not flow from the object of interest to the researcher, that is, the object is not understood as it is, but rather from the researcher to the object, which is to say that the meaning is projected onto it. One manifestation of this process, which can serve as a litmus test in our reality, is the use of value-laden terms in the categorization of observed phenomena. Thus, descriptions of these phenomena abound with words such as good or evil, and parts of the clan's narratives about the zone are constructed in this way. If we set aside bandits, military and mercenaries for obvious reason, we are left with freedom, duty, clear sky, monolith, and the ecologists. It is also worth noting that while the latter may have been envisioned as a faction in the initial documents, they certainly are not in the final product. Much like the loners, they are a faction in name only, but in reality, they are a scattered network of researchers connected through scientific work. This makes them highly relevant to the question of the noosphere, but for now we can leave them aside. Likewise, for the purposes of this analysis, there is no need to delve deeply into the narrative surrounding individual factions. Instead, we can focus solely on the essence. The two strongest factions among stalkers who maintain control over their own thoughts are duty and freedom. They represent polar opposites, embodying fundamentally different approaches to intervention. In this regard, duty believes that radical intervention is necessary to suppress the zone, eliminate its anomalies and the creatures it spawns, and ultimately destroy the zone itself. The zone is a manifestation of evil that threatens to consume humanity, and therefore it is the sacred duty of every member of this faction to prevent such a development. They are organized in a militaristic manner, armed to the teeth and equipped with top-tier protection, perfectly aligned with the core of their narrative: authority, discipline, and security. Their members thus find meaning in a grand cause and the conviction that they are doing the right thing, seeing themselves as a bulwark separating the weak from the forces of evil.
Нет, все равно. Пока зону не сделаем, не уйдем отсюда. Права у нас такого нет. Не дай бог в мир такое выползет. Черт, мы ведь какие уроды. Свобода всем даром. Какая тут свобода? Выпустить твари за периметр. Сами шизанутые, так в сторонку отойдите, не мешайте работать.
Of course, their goal remains highly abstract, and at no point do we learn what exactly it means to destroy the zone or how this is to be achieved. On the opposite side, we find Freedom, a faction that views intervention negatively as a violation through which human malice would disrupt the virgin landscapes of the zone, allegedly filled with various blessings that could benefit humanity. Among the ranks of this clan are a diverse group of individuals who share the belief that freedom from coercion, the kind that defines the human world they fled, can be found in this new environment. Thus, the zone represents potential both in terms of the anomalies it generates and in terms of individual liberation and the opportunity to indulge in bodily pleasures unrestrained or to construct one's life according to one's own standards.
Эти-то из долга так запарили, что уже совсем. Сами по-человечески не живете, ну и хрен с вами. Дайте другим, хоть не мешайте. Фанатики хреновые. Что в городе по-людски жить не давали, что тут началось. Долг этот долбаный, вояки скоты. Нет, чтобы оставить зону в покое. Все им надо под себя подмять. Все, блин, под контроль. Уроды.
Of course, as already mentioned, human malice, prejudice, weakness, and treachery have long since shaped and filled the zone, and the members of this faction cannot wash their hands of responsibility. The relationship between these two factions is particularly interesting because the core ideals they uphold, security and freedom, are two fundamental elements whose balance is frequently debated in our own reality. It is clear that both are of immense importance for survival, but it is equally evident that the expansion of one, at least as far as we know, can only come at the expense of the other. These are also two ideals, or rather two concepts, in the pursuit of which meaning is found. This phenomenon actually represents the second station on the path of cognition. Physical manifestations, limited and disappointingly natural, are replaced by abstractions that, due to their vastness, allow for a wide range of interpretations and forms of identification. They also serve as an ode to our cognitive capacities, which enable us to self-indulgently contemplate the seemingly boundless realm of imagination and ingenuity intended for us and our species to conquer. Meaning is imagined. However, when abstraction gives way to action, as mentioned, we come to realize that these pure forms easily collapse into the mud and that we are not as magnificent as we may have initially believed. On the other hand, the earlier mentioned expansion tied to these ideals is also reflected in the territorial expansion of their adherents. Thus, despite being driven by grand words, factions remain bound to physical space, often in conflict with one another. A faction is in reality a pack, augmented by the uniquely human ability for abstract reasoning. The survival, expansion, and evolution of life through the action of these clans become the survival, expansion, and evolution of ideas. The conflict then stems from the fact that it is impossible to determine an objective priority among ideals, because if they symbolize our uniqueness, then only we can establish a hierarchy among them. This brings us back to the same point made earlier with the monkeys and the monolith. Information flows from us toward these abstractions, which is to say that the meaning and purpose are assigned, not extracted. Again, we construct the path ourselves, we do not discover it. This makes it clear that the content hidden behind terms like security and freedom varies from person to person. Thus, divisions are to be expected not only between advocates of different ideals, but also within those very factions. However, as abstractions, these ideals exist like guiding stars, giving meaning to actions and casting at least some light into the black void of the cosmos. Yet, their very abstractness, their distance, can never bring fulfillment. No matter how persistently we walk toward a star, we can never reach it. On the contrary, we'll just end up right back where we started. Likewise, no matter how enchanting its light may be, it will never warm us. The most it can do is momentarily gladden the soul, ignite the imagination, and stir longing. A glance at campfire conversation reveals everything, for NPCs do not hide their thoughts and emotion. This gives us insights into the deep dissonance between factional narratives and the realities that living by these standards actually produce. The Duty faction, champions of heroism, resilience, and brotherhood, reveal their weakness, exhaustion, and drowsiness.
Однако дерьмово ситуевина складывается. Сколько уже тут паримся, а подмоги почти никакой. Ай, сколько тут еще дряни всякой. Чистить и чистить. Ну и ухайдокался я в полный ноль. А раскисать пока нельзя. Ох, нельзя. А группа моя... Никого уже. Никого. Что, защитник человечества? Спать хочешь? Нельзя, нельзя. Люди надеются на тебя. Как же надеются. Нифига они про нас не знают. Да и хрен с ней, со славой. Разобраться бы с этой зоной.
Their members, scattered across the zone on missions, remain alone, without support from headquarters. Those who manage to return bring with them the bitterness of guilt and sorrow for friends who have vanished forever. The order and strength depicted on propaganda posters give way to the chaos and fatigue of reality, and their warriors, despised and aware that no one outside the zone even knows they exist, are deprived of any joy in life. And what happens in the opposite camp? The members of freedom, champions of liberty, choice, and potential, discover that their existence boils down to bodily pleasures of which there is never enough.
А у меня вот ни косяка не осталось. И фиг его знает, где сейчас достать. Ух, сейчас бы толковый сейшн сбацать. До центров хорошо напустить, чтобы всех вставило. Эх, пивасика бы что ли, да с амульком. С хорошим таким мясистым амульком. Блин, ну какой из него командир? Фуфло. А из кожи лезет. Все бы ему командовать. Ну и какого хрена тут торчишь, а, спрашивается? Дуй на фирму какую-нибудь менеджером. Или в войско на контракт. О, точно. Там ему самое место.
When reflecting on their current state, they speak of smoking weed, of beer in their stomachs and needles in their veins. They dream of the sea, of hangovers and intoxication, of everything that is not here and now, everything that is not the so-called land of possibilities or the zone from the rhetoric. The imagined freedom and potential transform into addiction and idleness in reality, and their warriors, indifferent, drugged, and inevitably reliant on a command structure, pave the way for evil to spread. The supposed liberation from the military and from duty turns into enslavement to opiates and commanders, while the talk of opportunities serves merely as a facade for despair. Finally, we come to Clear Sky, the third among the free-minded stalker factions, which represents an active group whose existence is not reduced to looting, mercenary work, or state-driven motives. This faction was introduced in the second part of the original trilogy as an equivalent of the initially conceived ecologists, not merely a network of scientists, but a true clan led by experienced researchers. Naturally, Clear Sky plays a key role in this installment of the game and represents a particularly intriguing team, as they seem to be the only ones with a rough understanding of what truly lies behind the zone. Both their leader, N.A. Lebedev, and the prominent scientist E.F. Kalancha, mistakenly renamed to Bin Polev in the English localization, point out to the protagonist Scar from the very start that the world they find themselves in is the result of human activity. However, if we listen to other members of the faction, we discover that most of them have no real idea of what is actually going on. Quite the opposite. Their comments revolve around the belief that their leaders possess knowledge and therefore a plan, meaning there is no need to overthink things, only to listen and obey. Based on the comments and conversations of NPCs gathered around campfires, we can see more or less clearly that meaning is found in the belief that the learned men have a plan. No matter how complicated the zone may seem or how tedious and inexplicable the orders from superiors might be, there is a conviction that behind it all lies a clear understanding of the order of things and that all the pieces of the puzzle will eventually fall into place.
А я все равно не понимаю, как оно все в зоне устроено. Начальство умное, все разобраться пытается. А мое дело маленькое, с автоматом по болотам бегать. И я так понимаю, раз начальство там что-то исследует, то должна быть какая-то конкретная цель. Смысл. Лично я особо над смыслом не задумываюсь. Есть поставленная задача, за выполнение платят нормально, вот тебе и смысл с мотивацией. Спору нет, начальству виднее. А все же хочется иногда узнать, ради чего мы все это. Да, тут крути, не крути, маракуй, не маракуй, а все равно выйдет так, как командиры скажут. Ну или как зона решит.
However, for a group that prides itself on scientific pursuit, such blind faith in leadership seems dubious. Contrary to the principles of inquiry, the majority of its members follow orders blindly rather than seeking to discover and question. Just like with duty or freedom, there is a significant gap between the faction's narrative and its actual content. Yet, this discrepancy is not surprising when we consider the origins of Clear Sky. While interactions with the aforementioned scientists give the impression that they arrived at their conclusions about the zone's origins through research, one of the missions in Call of Pripyat reveals something entirely different. During an expedition to Laboratory X8, the protagonist, Major Dektyarev, comes across an order for the transfer of equipment, materials, and research team to Laboratory X7. The document reveals that the researchers in question are N.A. Lebedev, E.F. Kalancha, and V.I. Suslov. The first two are already familiar from the previous discussion, while the latter turns out to be Docent Suslov, a trader whom we also meet at the very beginning of Clear Sky. In other words, these individuals are members of the Group, a secret organization of researchers formed within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, the very same group that tampered with the noosphere and triggered an ecological catastrophe. Thus, it turns out that Clear Sky is not an organized clan of scientists, but rather that the aforementioned trio, along with a few other members, engage in research while the rest are there for work and profit, contrary to what Lebedev tells Kar. This very structure, with its centralization of knowledge and decision-making, ultimately leads to the faction's downfall once its leadership is eliminated. A rigid hierarchical order means that striking or neutralizing key nodes in the network results in the collapse of the whole. The same applies to errors. Disaster does not come out of nowhere, but rather as a consequence of misguided expectations, such as the belief that eliminating Strelok would put an end to the emissions. The leadership's miscalculation ultimately costs the entire community. This fate is directly tied to the logic of how their former associates from C consciousness were structured, a point we will return to later. For now, let us note the following. The curse of alienation and disorientation follows us like a shadow. We have seen this in our reflection on the novel, in our analysis of individual stalkers in the game, and in the film as well. It is one of the central themes associated with the vast expanses of the zone, regardless of the medium in which it is explored. In their desire to escape from it and avoid the dull stares in the metro, stalkers expose themselves to all kinds of dangers, and yet even these seemingly untouched landscapes offer no real solace.
Ох, неохота мне за хабаром сегодня плестись. Сейчас бы дома оказаться, в гамачке да с книжкой толковой. Пожрать бы чего хорошего. Так ведь нету. А колбасу и батоны нынче хреновые делать стали. Концентраты, сплошные. А дома-то как было? Придешь вечером, а баба домашнего на стол, горячего, ах.
They long for family, a good book and home. Some seek refuge in a group that offers purpose and belief, However, metaphorical merging with the collective body may silence the soul's cry for a time, but soon disillusionment sets in, or the idealized image of unity gets shattered in some other way, and the same problems return with equal or even greater intensity. The relentless curiosity of our species endures, driving us to question, to expand our horizons, to push boundaries, all of which are prerequisites of survival. The comfort found in established maps of meaning is eventually overcome in one of two ways. Either inquisitive individuals begin to question them, or empirical reality starts to erode them, revealing that what we once took as a foundation of security and meaning was, in fact, nothing more than a fig leaf. It is fortunate if we recognize the latter in time, but the true heroism of humanity lies in the former. Let us now listen to Richard Newnan's thoughts after his conversation with Professor Pillman.
So they are scared too. Scared, the eggheads. And maybe that's how it should be. They should be even more scared than the rest of us ordinary folks put together, because we merely don't understand a thing, but they at least understand how much they don't understand. They gaze into this bottomless pit and know that they will inevitably have to climb down. Their hearts are racing, but they'll have to do it. Except they don't know how or what awaits them at the bottom, or, most important, whether they'll be able to get back out. Meanwhile, we sinners look the other way, so to speak. Listen, maybe that's how it should be. Let things take their course, and we'll muddle through somehow. He was right about that. Mankind's most impressive achievement is that it has survived and intends to continue doing so.
Seen from this perspective, we get an image of scientists and researchers as the light-bringers of humanity on its path of survival and expansion. In this regard, the ecologists in the game are the true antithesis of the monolith and the only serious player when it comes to meaning and knowledge. Contrary to the previously mentioned desire for happiness free for all, which essentially implies giving up on the search for and awareness of truth and consequently humanity itself, scientists embrace our inquisitive nature despite the enormous cost and the fundamentally insatiable longing. Just think of the Austrian genius Ludwig Boltzmann, or perhaps the greatest Serb Nikola Tesla. Genius, research, discipline, and questioning often, if not always, bring loneliness, exhaustion, and disillusionment due to the deconstruction of previous worldviews or the inability of contemporaries to comprehend the depth of what Newnan calls a bottomless pit. Of course, this abyss remains ultimately unfathomable, but the mere striving for its understanding and the courage to face the darkness that makes it is the thing that truly counts. Thus, we can say when comparing the path to meaning in knowledge with the path to meaning in belonging or the fulfillment of desires and happiness, that scientists heroically accept painful existence in contrast to the illusion of success. For everything around us shows that merging with the collective, fulfilling desires and happiness can't be counted as success. All three of these make us less active, less combative, and the euphoria they initially bring fades quickly. When it vanishes, we face challenges again, but poorer for the time spent and the accomplishments not achieved during moments of total surrender to sweet sensations. This sentiment permeates 2001: A Space Odyssey and is most evident in the final scenes of the film. The complexity of the evolutionary journey, the fears and challenges of existence, the expansion and exploration despite the unfathomable darkness, all find their justification in contrast to comfortable, yet meaningless life of abundance. A peaceful death without noise or fanfare still does not bring relief, but rather a hand reaching toward the monolith, a plea for another chance. In doing so, the parallel with our ancestors is cemented as they initiated the awakening with the same gesture, and the benevolent creator offers a new opportunity. A similar interpretation can be found in Stalker the movie, where the ending, though lacking resolution, restores the vibrancy of the world outside the zone in the scenes with the child, nicknamed Monkey. Stress, self-examination, exploration, and passage through an inner crisis can trigger a process of healing and a renewed belief in the magic of existence. Though we never see the room's magic directly, we witness the daughter's telepathic abilities, which testify to the power of the human mind and its decisive role in our existence, despite the heavy price that consciousness demands. The evolutionary process continues, the new generation learns about the endeavors of the previous one, and humanity is granted another chance. Similarly, since we have previously stated that the symbolic representation of wish fulfillment in the game is through the fact that Strelok is only faced with death and blindness, it is clear that this conclusion can also be transposed to the world of the video game. Meaning lies in knowledge, not in the fulfillment of desires, while the wish granter as a manifestation of the wrong path demonstrates the futility, artificiality, and abuse of this longing. Likewise, in the contrast to the clan members who, no matter how convinced they are of the correctness of their worldview, understand virtually nothing, scientists, using Noonan's terms once again, understand how little they truly understand and how complex the problem of the zone really is. This leads us to another important conclusion. Unlike factions that provide us with an answer in a form that insists on is, scientists in Noonan's interpretation do so through negation, is not. Because in the statement, they at least understand how much they don't understand, there is an inherent message that in many cases they have deconstructed and discarded previously accepted hypotheses or worldviews that, for a time, allowed them to understand. Therefore, knowledge lies in rejection, not confirmation. But before we let the allure of our thoughts carry us too far, it is necessary to highlight a problem in this kind of simplification, namely, our tendency to view complex social phenomena as a homogeneous block, whether it is humanity, civilization, the state, or science. The inability to recognize their components and the specificities of the actors or coalitions that make them up is a direct consequence of what we previously warned about, the mixing of pure forms with the untidy reality. This can certainly be forgiven for someone like Noonan, whose thoughts might be swirling in his head during a drive, but such luxury cannot be easily accepted in our case. Therefore, it is important to return to our limitations, prejudices, weaknesses, and the evil to which we are capable. Scientists are not exempt from this. After all, it is precisely members of this social layer who create the zone in the world of Stalker. If we now invoke Christian mythology, we will remember that Lucifer actually means Lightbringer, a name derived from the term we have not used by accident in describing scientists. And it is this fallen angel's ambition to seize power in heaven and assume a divine role that leads us to the third point on the path of cognition. To recall, the path of the search for meaning and truth goes from the monkeys and monolith, where the foundation is sight which gives birth to thought, through clans and abstractions where the foundation is thought seemingly separate from the physical phenomena, to the sea consciousness and the noosphere, in whose foundation lies being, liberated from sensory and physical limitations. The chain is as follows. Senses and interaction with the environment create thought. Man is dependent on an evolutionary path which he did not consciously choose. However, it is precisely this development that drives him toward the gradual development of a yearning and the idea of liberation from disappointingly natural. Thought undergoes expansion, man creates imagined ideals purified of everything he perceives as negative, and then engages in activities in the physical world to realize them with inevitable failure. The ideal remains a guiding star for a time, but its shine gradually fades. Thought evolves further, and as an alternative to physical territorial expansion, the idea of transcendence emerges. What if individual minds merge into one whole, ultimate intelligence, and in the so-called final stage of cosmic development become one with the universe? What if, at the omega point, the essence of humanity transforms into the strings that weave the universe? What if thought and action become one and Homo sapiens becomes a deity or merges with one? What if Homo sapiens becomes the creator, meaning, and truth? This would seemingly mark the end of the previous futile search, regardless of whether it manifested through ritual, faith, or evolutionary idealism. However, as in all previous stages, information once again primarily flows from us, not necessarily towards us. The omega point and the noosphere are merely ideas to which we attach desired outcomes, but desires and fulfillment dramatically differ, and once again we know nothing about the path to these ideals. Therefore, creation itself is a consequence of our limitations, whatever they may be, and there are many of them. On the other hand, excessive self-belief, a longing for divine powers, and the idea that it is our right to judge empirical reality can easily invoke nemesis. Hubris in the blink of an eye results in a punishment that humiliates what is elevated, brings the overly joyous down from their heights, and in this way establishes equality. It is clear that at this level there will also be differences in understanding the path to divinity and the interpretation of the justification for such activities. And as we've said earlier, reconsideration, debate, returning to starting points, and reconciliation require much time. Time that self-proclaimed emperors, grand inquisitors, Führers of all kind, benefactors of mankind who seek to remake the world potentially do not have. This brings us to the final step, to the wish granter, to the monolith as an object and a faction. In the world of Stalker, the self-proclaimed saviors shorten the time needed for decision-making through the centralization of power and conspiratorial alliances, through death as a stick and synthetic meaning as a carrot. To achieve a world of freedom, peace, purity, and happiness, they enslave, kill, or experiment on their fellow countrymen. In their ambition to reach superhuman status, they deprive anyone who is not part of their group of chosen ones of their humanity. The meaning they offer involves the erasement of mental abilities and submissiveness, so the choice of the term monolith is not surprising. On the other hand, the punishment for those who seek the truth or fulfillment outside their will is death. The wish granter turns things upside down. Do you want immortality? You will become metal. Do you want to rule? You will become energy for the monolith. Do you believe that humanity must be under control? We will erase your thoughts and hand you over to the darkness. Do you want the zone to disappear? You will no longer see it because we will blind you. Taking this into account, it is not surprising that throughout the entire game we see clear lines leading to the logic on which the Soviet Union functioned. Because, as fictional character Teja, depicted by Branislav Lečić, says in a Serbian movie called The Professional, it took nature 1,000,000 years to turn a monkey into a man, but communism only took 50 years to turn a man back into a monkey. However, we should not fall into the simplistic demonization of communism, which is common in American propaganda. Unlike the image in which red demons from the East seek to enslave the good, honest, and freedom-loving West, the tragedy of communism is also the tragedy of humanity in general. If we were to summarize this in one quote, there is no better candidate than Czech novelist Milan Kundera, although he speaks only about Central Europe. Anyone who thinks that the communist regimes of Central Europe are exclusively the work of criminals is overlooking a basic truth. The criminal regimes were not made by criminals, but by enthusiasts convinced they had discovered the only road to paradise. They defended the road so valiantly that they were forced to execute many people. Later, it became clear that there was no paradise, that the enthusiasts were therefore murderers. In their murderous battle for an earthly paradise, communist regimes provided a colorful lie which so deeply impregnated human souls longing for meaning that to this day this synthetic substance survives like tar in hard-to-reach places. Therefore, it should not be surprising that nostalgia for the red times does not only exist among those who personally carried communism in one form or another, such as in the USSR or Yugoslavia, but also in Romania or Germany, where they coined a special term for it, nostalgie. Of course, as in most other cases, nostalgia primarily comes from dissatisfaction with the present, reflecting on a past that has been largely filtered or even imagined, as well as a longing for youth. However, this does not mean that there is not a deeper problem of lost meaning or security. As much as Yugoslavism and communism are personally foreign and even hostile ideas or aspirations from my perspective, for others they represented lofty ideals. And I vividly remember the stories of older neighbors or relatives who longingly recounted how they were a part of the struggle for liberation from foreign or domestic predators, regardless of whether they were partisan fighters, workers, or intellectuals. And that is why many are not able to truly grasp the tragedy of existence throughout the former USSR after the collapse of the murderous system. As we said in the introduction, once the colorful light dissipates and the synthetic meaning evaporates, every soul is left alone before the abyss, battered by rain and winds. It is not surprising then that some wish to rid themselves of the burden of freedom that befell them. Let us now look at how Stalker deals with this trauma.
Монолит. Он ушел от нас. Не оставляй меня, Монолит. Не оставляй нас, твоих детей. Мы сильны твоей волей, Монолит. Ты направил нас. Ты дал нам видеть и знать. Почему мы не слышим твой голос? Монолит, почему ты оставил нас? Мы плачем. Мы ждем. Монолит, Монолит, вернись к покинутым детям своим. Монолит, твои дети ждут тебя, твою мудрость, твою силу, твой свет.
Монолит, я твой верный слуга.
Only the silence of stone remained, vast and unyielding, beneath a sky that had forgotten them. For a long time, stalkers spun tales about the winding path leading from Lake Yantar to the Red Forest. In hushed voices tinged with melancholy and dread, they would say no human foot had ever set upon it, for each step carried the threat of a harrowing death in the jaws of fearsome anomalies. These anomalies had appeared in the same days when the forest's foliage had turned sinister hues of red, ominous yet no less enchanting for it. It was as if overnight the wooded landscape had taken on the semblance of flesh or some organ of an incomprehensible entity, and the trails that cut through it had grown into veins formed to nourish that being with any living creature foolish or careless enough to find itself in such a place. Yet, with the same terrifying swiftness with which it had arisen, the situation changed one day after a massive zone discharge, an emission that swept away the barriers along the path, seemingly shaped by an inscrutable will, a will intent on offering the curious a chance to uncover the secrets of this alien world. Few were those who walked it without pausing to gaze at the enchanted expanse, encircled by a stone fence with a small, rusted gate, still bearing traces of once blue paint. The spell of that place was deepened by the little river on the left, while the densely packed trees, ablaze with red leaves, beckoned wanderers to explore the depths framed by their canopies. And yet they stood silent, holding within them the grim secret behind their hypnotic stillness, for no fortunate soul had yet dared such a journey and returned to speak of the experience. It was as if, in the shadows they wove, Aleshan, the forest warden, watched jealously over the beauty and peace of his unmoving herd. And yet, time, as always, gradually opens doors and reveals many truths. So the stalkers came to learn that there was someone who could move through the gloom of this mystical realm as though it were his home. On the fringes of the described landscape lives the Forester, the only man in the entire trilogy known to have inhabited the exclusion zone even before the catastrophe of 1986, and who still remembers the once green groves. Like a favored child of this mysterious entity, the old man seems chosen for a purpose, endowed with the ability to navigate seemingly impassable paths choked with anomalies. The weight of experience etched into a face lined with deep wrinkles has turned him into a living archive of fantastic tales, stories that to many may sound like the ramblings of a senile fool. Yet those who show breadth of spirit and patience for the old man open themselves to secrets far too heavy for the shallow minds and narrow awareness of those among stalkers who seek only to reduce their adventure to a lucrative hunt for artifacts. Only the curious, thoughtful adventurers can find in his words fragments of an explanation for the origin of the zone. For the old man speaks of a city of the dead where spirits now roam, but one may well wonder whether the living ever truly dwelled there. From his account, we learn of the strange behavior of the former residents of a nearby settlement, people with unorthodox thoughts and weary eyes, who wandered the cramped, blind streets of the city like specters without a will of their own. The Forester recounts their relationship with the Soviet authorities and the intensity of their love and devotion proportionate only to their poverty and the criminality of the communist paradise. Like victims of a perverse experiment in mind control, these unfortunate souls would zealously chant praises to the red mist, even as their cheeks hollowed into toothless mouths, their eyes became ever more pronounced on the heads of living skeletons, and their faces paled from hunger. Stranger still was the fact that this was a settlement of scientists and employees of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, people from whom one would expect clarity of mind and sharp critical thought. It would turn out, however, that their connection to the plant was not merely professional. They had become faithfully fused with the fission reactors of that facility. On the night of the catastrophe and the first emission, each and every one of them vanished from the face of the earth, scorched by some unknown energy, leaving behind only shadows etched into the walls of their homes. And though in Slavic mythology one of the gravest curses is for a man to be left without a shadow, we find ourselves in a world where the shadows have been left without people. The lives they live seem not to have been their own, but alone granted by the mercy and goodwill of some force which, in the moment of its own disappearance, chose to erase them as well. Thus, the inversion of mythological symbolism feels more than fitting. Mere existence in that cursed place was not a gift from God or a fortunate accident, it was a part of a calculation or a plan, devised by creators whose intentions no one could grasp, and whose goodwill was more than suspect. And though only the forester still remembers their fate, the name of the city endures among stalkers, weighing heavily on their speech and conjuring scenes that burden the minds and poison the dreams. The name of the city where dead souls wander. Limansk. Listeners will hopefully forgive the shift in style and the creative liberties taken in conveying the story of the forester in Limansk, but I do believe it is the best way to draw attention to the relatively subtle revelation of key information about the zone, something Stalker certainly does not lack. Of course, as mentioned in the introduction, uncovering such details requires patience, thoroughness, and a willingness to read through the parts of NPC dialogue not covered by voice acting. Beyond the broader narrative involving underground laboratories, Agroprom, and the behind-the-scenes machinations uncovered through documents found during main quests, it is precisely the personal experience of the zone's sole native inhabitant that lends the story depth and authenticity. Although he is not the only one whose words hint at a hidden game, figures such as Professor Kruglov, Professor Ozersky, and General Krylov also offer their own insights. It is only the forester whose testimony stems from direct lived experience. Thus, his account of how the villagers avoided the city overshadowed by a series of radio towers and how they would suffer piercing headaches when approaching it adds weight to the mystery surrounding Limansk. It is my conviction that the story behind it echoes the masterpiece The Doomed City, written by the Strugatsky brothers. One of the central themes that fascinated this extraordinarily talented duo, and which forms the backbone of the novel, is the tension between order and chaos and the problems and benefits that emerge from them. In their view, this tension represents an unresolved factor in human existence and in the formation of functional society. Chaos, though a source of destruction and suffering, also harbors the seed of freedom. Yet, precisely because of that destructive nature, true enjoyment of this freedom is impossible, prompting calls for control. The tragedy of human existence lies in the fact that attempts to establish such control on a broader scale inevitably lead to oppression and terror, whether by the state, a party, a faction, or any other organized force. As such, these efforts become the very cause of the loss of true human agency, the capacity from which order can naturally emerge, free will. In the words of one of the novel's protagonists who reflects on his companion's doubts about the purpose and nature of the experiment around which the book's plot revolves, "You have a rather strange perspective on all this. This isn't a kingdom of absolute evil. It is more like chaos, and we're here to put it in order. And how can we put it in order if we don't possess free will?" This question has undoubtedly shaped the very video game we're discussing, so in that sense, Limansk is the experiment. However, we do not possess enough information to discern the initial intentions of its experimenters, and yet, whatever those intentions were, they clearly culminated in the erasure of freedom and ultimately the disappearance of the human test subjects. On the other hand, if we turn to indirect interpretation, we find clear symbolism in the fact that once the path to the city opened, the warriors of freedom and duty rushed toward it only to annihilate each other in their battle for control. The clash between the bearers of freedom and the bearers of order resulted in mutual destruction and their disappearance from that accursed place. By the beginning of Clear Sky, Limansk became a stronghold of Monolith. The irreconcilable deadlock between the two opposing drives, order and freedom, results in a totalitarian force that exists solely for its own sake. Consciousness, the mother of the very need to resolve this tension, the seed of the perception of both order and freedom, is lost. Is this not a development that threatens the entire zone, perhaps even humanity as a whole? Be that as it may, the narrative surrounding Limansk offers another crucial layer of information. From everything stated so far, we begin to glimpse the existence of covert Soviet research activities, which, judging by the available documents and commentary from various zone figures, were directed toward mind control, initially of animals, later of humans. This becomes evident already in the main quests of Shadow of Chernobyl and the notes and correspondence scattered throughout the underground facilities, and is reinforced by details such as those found in the story of Limansk. Yet, as fantastical as this premise may sound, it is actually grounded in historical reality. It draws upon real Soviet attempts to establish precisely this form of control. Certainly, the roots of such ambitions lie much earlier in the days before the USSR was fully formed, when early enthusiasts, who would ultimately prove to be murderers and enemies of freedom, dreamed of a new man. Dissatisfied with the existing one, they were determined to reshape him at any cost. It did not take long before their fantasies of mastering one's own body and emotions transformed into a thirst to control the minds of others, a thirst that eventually took on concrete form. As Vladimir Velminsky testifies in his study of the Soviet man, Homo Sovieticus, toward the end of 1989, the year that marked the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, inhabitants of the region could watch Anatoly Mikhailovich Kashpirovsky conducting a televised seance intended to calm the public and restore their faith in communism. However, this undertaking was not merely a reflection of the absurd ideas held by the system's architects overcome by panic during its twilight. Rather, it was the culmination of earlier research from which emerged the notion of brainwaves and the possibility of uploading and controlling thought, all of which was based on the idea of the psychon, a supposed biomagnetic medium, a carrier of information directed from the sender to the target. Had it succeeded, the project would have turned the dream of uninterrupted long-term planning, free from objective difficulties and subjective weaknesses, into a reality of controlled existence. As for the theoretical foundations, they were laid by a range of figures, the scientific management theorists Alexei Kapitonovich Gastev, circus trainer Vladimir Leonidovich Durov, neurologist Vladimir Mikhailovich Byehterev, electrical engineer Bernard Bernardovich Kaczynski, and psychological cybernetics researcher Pavel Ivanovich Gulyaev. These names may sound obscure to many, but even the basic investigation reveals that the project was, in fact, quite serious, at least when measured by the commitment of those involved, if not by its results. The central idea rested on Gastev's conception of man as a programmable entity whose movements and thought processes could be optimized. All of this was directed toward ensuring the highest possible productivity of Soviet workers, in line with Taylorist principles of scientific management which had previously enchanted the American world. Yet Gastev's ambition extended much further. He believed that influence should be exerted not merely on the level of motion, but on the deeper biological stratum, an idea that would later inspire related initiatives. The research he conducted and the findings he produced belonged to the pre-cybernetic modeling in Russia and would go on to influence the development of the first computer workstations. Still, his tireless pioneering did not secure him high state office. Instead, he was swept up in the paranoid delirium of Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin and executed in 1939 in Moscow's suburbs. Building upon these efforts were the writings and reflections of Vladimir Byehterev, who in turn drew upon Durov's accomplishments in animal training. From the perspective of the Russian neurologist, consciousness was merely an epiphenomenon of specific brain functions, a byproduct. Consequently, he considered it fully reasonable to attempt a simulation of consciousness that would demonstrate how the utterance of a word simultaneously emits a thought. His experiments convinced him that such transmission did indeed occur, and that it was possible to mentally influence another person from a distance through a kind of living matter which he associated with electromagnetic waves. Interestingly, Bechterev also met a suspicious end. After reportedly examining Comrade Stalin and likely identifying signs of paranoia, many suspect that he was killed on the orders of the General Secretary of the USSR. In any case, it is clear that disappearance or death at the hands of the Red Mist was no mystery to the inhabitants of the communist utopia. It is also significant that Bechterev collaborated with Durov, who in turn worked with Kaczynski, himself in contact with towering figures such as the aforementioned Konstantin Tsiolkovsky and Alexander Romanovich Belyaev, the science fiction author whose novel The Ruler of the World was directly inspired by the very ambition of mental control. In fact, the network of interaction among Russia's brightest minds was deeply interwoven, encompassing a vast portion of the country's scientific, technical, and artistic elite. The ideas that emerged from this exchange, however, were not limited to brainwaves and mind control, but delved further into questions of telepathy and telekinesis. Naturally, not everyone was thrilled by these pursuits. Belyaev's literary work stands as one of the earliest warnings about the nature of such ambitions. Still, we ought to reflect on the origin of this drive for control, which cannot be reduced solely to political or dictatorial motives, at least not when it comes to scientists. Although, of course, in a totalitarian regime, everything eventually becomes subject to the logic of state and ideology. It is entirely possible that a part of the answer lies in a quote that, according to Velminsky, can be found in Belyaev's novel. To paraphrase, the goal is to restructure the minds of Soviet citizens who are not even aware of the hidden folders of their subconscious, where the concentrated power of thought has stored everything terrifying and dangerous to humanity. Sound familiar? Anyone who has encountered the representative of the sea consciousness at the end of Shadow of Chernobyl may recall the calm, aged voice explaining to Strelok the origin of the zone.
Our main goal was to make small adjustments to the noosphere, allowing us to remove things like anger, cruelty, greed, and other negative factors from the planet.
Though the narrative of the game introduces the concept of the noosphere, the underlying ambition is the same: the desire to purge what we recognize as evil or negative from human existence. But with that, we are once again merely scratching the surface. If this ambition arises from a need, then we are left with the deeper question: where does that need come from? Naturally, it is easy to ask any person whether they would like evil to be removed from the world, but even if billions nodded in agreement, and even if such a response felt intuitively right, we would not have learned anything new. To truly illuminate this, we must return to the path of cognition and to what emerges as a product of human consciousness itself. The answer, in truth, lies in reflection, in that which, according to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, one of the founding thinkers behind the concept of the noosphere, makes the human species unique. Reflection can be summarized as follows. We can say with confidence that animals know something, but they do not know that they know. Were it otherwise, we would have noticed systems of ideas and material creations stemming from the conscious accumulation of knowledge and discoveries. In reality, only human consciousness has gained the capacity to observe itself as an object of inquiry. It became aware of potential and continuity, thus opening a door to a dimension of reality that transcends individual existence. In mythological terms, humanity has eaten from the tree of knowledge and came to know good and evil, stepping out of an allegedly blissful unconscious paradise. And it is precisely this reflection that enables a certain rare few among us to, in Noonan's words, know how much they do not know, just as it drives others to contemplate the burden of consciousness and the moral responsibility toward life after becoming aware of the scale of suffering in the world, after becoming aware of their own vulnerability and the horror of unconscious existence in a cruel and unjust world. Seen from this perspective, knowledge and science emerge as weapons in a struggle against Mother Nature, who walks carelessly over ash and bone, both creating and destroying. It is therefore no surprise that many scientists driven by noble and humanistic intentions have been deeply concerned with the fate of the living world and committed to building a future that would relieve it of suffering, fear, disease, death, and destruction. Let us cast light on this through the words of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. In the past, I would look upon imperfect people, the crippled, the unfortunate, the sick, women and children, and think that they had nothing to do with me. I believed, albeit unconsciously, that foolish people made me seem intelligent, that the misfortunes of others highlighted my own happiness, that the weak were merely my competition, and that it was good to be surrounded by weakness, ignorance, slavery, suffering, illness, and so on. All of this made me feel stronger and more noble by comparison. If they were stronger and happier than me, I would be their servant. We never openly admit such thoughts, but they exist, at least partially. Now that I have come to understand that all the perfection of the world, all its vices and evils will one day become my own fate, I look upon the surrounding imperfection with horror. Their destiny is my destiny after death. I no longer find people amusing. There is no longer that hidden malice or hypocritical pity in me, only horror. Horror and concern. How can we rid the earth of all that is evil, miserable, wretched, of all suffering and all poverty? Only then will I no longer fear being born as a tormented animal, tortured to death, as a man of a degraded race, as a sick person, a cripple, an idiot. This is the concern that is the goal of life, to eliminate every evil on earth. This is no longer sentimentalism or charity to me, but an egoistic imperative which I strive to realize with all my strength. Reason, science, and egoism compel me to strive towards sanctity in the highest sense of that word. Without it, I am miserable, afraid that I may be reborn as some suffering, unconscious creature. These concerns stem from a particular worldview developed by Tsiolkovsky, one that envisions life as a cyclical process, a continual return to existence through the union and separation of atoms. Sensitivity, as an inherent property of every cosmic particle, transforms into sentience once it enters a living being. Not merely reactivity to the external environment, but the capacity to experience pleasure and pain. Beneath this idea lies the conviction that the entire universe is alive, though only higher animals are capable of expressing true emotional depth. It is precisely for this reason that the atoms from which we are made, after our death, enter a dormant state, one of sensitivity without awareness, only to inevitably reawaken into feeling as they recombine and separate through natural process. If the conditions are right, any matter may become organic, therefore all inorganic matter is potentially alive. The resulting idea of this view is panpsychism. Let us return now to the cruelty of nature, a notion that tormented Teilhard de Chardin just as deeply. Earlier we mentioned the blind groping in the dark, that is, life's struggle to carve a path forward through endless trial and error, creating and destroying without concern for the individual being. As stated before, the individual is nothing more than a thrown bolt, a disposable probe in life's search for passage. Even the feeling of uniqueness or heroism is simply a motivating illusion designed to push the organism further along the path of exploration. Mother Nature walks blindfolded, heedlessly trampling over the dust of crushed lives. Paradoxically, for life to exist, life must perish. On the other hand, another process that characterizes this struggle is the joining of living particles, through which they enter a state of partial enslavement, becoming links in a chain stretching across time and space. Yet, with the emergence of spirit comes a change in perception. The world's indifference towards its elements is transformed into deep concern. This concern becomes conscious, awakened within the realm of the person. Thus, the previously mentioned reflection gives rise to concern, and concern gives birth to the desire for liberation from this brutal order. From an awareness of the fate of living beings and the doom brought on by pack, tribal, or factional divisions in which individuality is lost, emerges the intent to seize control and overcome suffering. Yet the knowledge of good and evil, even if we treat them as absolutes, and assume that humanity is capable of discerning them with precision, does not carry with it the knowledge of the right path. That's why we say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And still, the desire for righteousness burns the soul unbearably. But unlike the blind woman who over long ages creates and destroys at random, yet through the sheer number of attempts yield some vaguely positive results, man creates and destroys deliberately within a much shorter span of time. And it is precisely this deliberateness that stems from our limited, however dazzling intellect, from our fractured perspective and our always questionable morality without the luxury of repeated experiments. Now imagine how much more complex all this becomes once we factor in power, authority, ideology, and paranoia. So let us return to Velminsky. Although engineers, radio technicians, and psychologists conducted research that allegedly confirmed the electromagnetic emission of thoughts, statistical verification casted serious doubt on these conclusions. With Stalin's rise to the position of General Secretary and the development of his personality cult, the visionary enlightenment or technicist character of such research was gradually abandoned. The leader became the living embodiment of the omnipotent and omnipresent state apparatus, whether in the material or immaterial realm. To illustrate this, Velminsky refers to the 1950 film The Fall of Berlin, specifically a scene in which Soviet generals discuss the assault on the German capital. Red lines, symbolic representations of different divisions, stream toward and merge into a single black point, Berlin. The framing emphasizes the beauty of this coordination before the camera passes without a cut through a wall, transporting viewers to a new setting, the Yalta Conference. There, the General Secretary lays out a precise military strategy, while Allied leaders and officers listen attentively. There are no intermediaries between the leader and the front. The Soviet society is united, without wires, without devices, all think as one, all of them knowing everything. With the persistence of the cult even after Stalin's death, this ideal, now embodied by his image, became the immortal force of an imagined, tightly interconnected society whose members have nothing to hide from one another. Of course, we know today that the technical solutions, research results, and theoretical reflections of these individuals ultimately proved flawed. And while from the vantage point of historical distance we may scoff at ideas that now seem absurd, it becomes evident just how artistically potent these same ideas are when used to portray the inherent evil of such undertakings and of communism more broadly, especially given the other revolutionary activities that were far from laughable. Thus, in Stalker, we are presented with the great monolith and its fearless warriors, a collective without intermediaries. The leader directly caresses their thoughts, offers comfort and meaning, and in return receives total submission and the synchronized response of individual bodies operating under the command of a collective mind. Behind it all, we see scientists driven by good intentions. In this way, consciousness and mind, once seen by thinkers, scientists as intrinsic value, become enslaved in the supposed process of evolution toward an ultimate intelligence, and in that slavery they rot to the point where liberation from control brings not joy or purpose to most of them, but sorrow, tears, depression, and suicidality. That is why the cries of the monolith warriors with which we opened this chapter are so painful, and that is why when we loot their corpses in Call of Pripyat after the monolith has fallen, we find bottles of vodka they never drank in shadow of Chernobyl, back when they still heard the voice of their master. However, as we mentioned earlier, our goal is not to reduce communism to a banal propagandistic mantra, but to observe it in the form it rightfully takes, as a tragedy of humanity in its efforts to resolve the enduring tension between chaos and order. Within this tragedy, Führers and general secretaries are not omnipotent villains, but manifestations of the responses that communities and individuals offer to the challenges they face and the ambitions they hold. The Grand Inquisitor does not exist without his flock, though, of course, this cannot be used as an excuse for a single crime, let alone mass destruction or enslavement. Thus, we can break down the problem into two additional segments: conscious submission and levels of reflection. Let us begin with the first. In analyzing alienation and the heavy toll of consciousness, we have touched upon the different tactics and mental processes that define the human species. The final step we mentioned in that progression is belonging, a state that provides both security in the face of external threats and a sense of meaning. Within the company of like-minded individuals, one finds affirmation of the truth or righteousness of one's worldview, which becomes the foundation from which meaning is drawn. However, no matter how sophisticated a conceptual system may be, over time its misalignment with reality becomes increasingly evident, or at the very least, phenomena emerge for which it cannot account. As a result, even those who show no great spiritual breadth or serious concern for the structure of existence inevitably enter into a cycle of doubt, disillusionment, consolation, or something similar. One unconscious tactic that arises in such moments is the search for an authority, someone who, at the cost of submission and domination, relieves one of the burdens of heavy thoughts, decisions, and responsibility. This is a response not only to the need for existential security, but also to the need for distinguishing good from evil in critical moments and the need for understanding in Dr. Pillman's sense. Here, we are not merely speaking of belonging and union through shared ideas, but of leadership and union through command. In this way, even the previously discussed abstractness of ideals, which makes them prone to differing interpretations, is overcome through the appearance of their supposed embodiment in the figure of their interpreter, the leader. Thus, this understanding is further enriched, as it enables one to grasp everything without knowing anything, while also providing an arbiter, someone who is both authorized and ideally capable of resolving doubts and answering counter-arguments, thereby re-establishing or strengthening conviction in the framework that gives rise to such understanding. This brings us to the Grand Inquisitor, whom the engineer from the movie Stalker as well as myself have repeatedly invoked as the archetype of the benefactor of mankind, and to the question, what would an unannounced visit from Christ to his children look like? And I don't mean the famous return at the end of days, but rather an informal visit before that final hour. And what would the relationship between the ideal and the institution look like? In the story we're referencing, the Inquisitor represents the manifestation of organized religion, authority and ambition, but also the human response to the aforementioned tension between order and chaos, freedom and security. He is the earthly interpreter of sacred mysteries and of the true nature of human happiness, who one day, quite unexpectedly, comes into contact with Christ, light, truth and power incarnate. And the masterful portrayal of the dynamic between these two as given to us by Fyodor Mikhailovich remains deeply relevant to the argument we are constructing. Witnessing the people's rapture at the appearance of the God-man, the Inquisitor orders Christ to be seized and imprisoned. During a nighttime visit to the dungeon where the Savior is held, he delivers a monologue laying out his vision of the human condition. He believes that Jesus overestimated human strength when he gave them freedom of will, and he emphasizes that the sea of choices laid before man, manifested anew each day, is an unbearable burden for the majority who yearn for order and safety. By granting them free will, Christ in fact condemned humankind to agony, confusion, and inner torment. In the Inquisitor's own words, nothing has ever been more insupportable for a man and a human society than freedom. Christ's transgression, according to the Inquisitor, can be understood through the lens of the temptations he endured in the wilderness, where he chose a path that ordinary people cannot follow. In such conditions, Jesus chooses heavenly bread over the satisfaction of earthly hunger. He preserves faith despite all things, refusing to test God and declining to demand miracles. He leaves freedom to mankind rather than seizing control over the earthly kingdoms and establishing order and peace. In so doing, he fails to provide an adequate response to the three basic human needs: the need for material security, for constant reassurance in one's faith, and for unity. Thus, according to the Inquisitor, the Roman Church takes this burden upon itself, offering people mystery, miracle, and authority, and by doing so knowingly sides with the terrible spirit, the tempter. Yet this choice is not made out of vanity or a hunger for power and gold, but from a clever-eyed understanding of human weakness. The Inquisitor reproaches Christ for placing such weighty trials before a flock unfit to bear them, thereby sealing their fate not only in the afterlife, but in their earthly hope as well. From this perspective, Jesus becomes the savior only of the strong and the proud, willing to abandon the sea of the weak to the fires of brimstone. And yet, part of Dostoevsky's greatness lies in the fact that the characters who voice ideas contrary to his own are always the most intelligent. And in the case of the Inquisitor, we are speaking of an extraordinarily strong individual as well. Just consider the grandeur of the following extended passage. The most painful secrets of their consciousness, all they will bring to us, and we shall have an answer for all. And they will be glad to believe our answer, for it will save them from the great anxiety and terrible agony they endure at present in making a free decision for themselves. And all will be happy, all the millions of creatures except the 100,000s who rule over them. For only we who guard the mystery, shall be unhappy. There will be thousands of millions of happy babes and 100,000 sufferers who have taken upon themselves the curse of the knowledge of good and evil. Peacefully they will die, peacefully they will expire in thy name, and beyond the grave they will find nothing but death. But we shall keep the secret, and for their happiness we shall allure them with the reward of heaven and eternity. Though if there were anything in the other world, it certainly would not be for such as they. It is prophesied that thou wilt come again in victory, thou wilt come with thy chosen, the proud and strong. But we will say that they have only saved themselves, but we have saved all. We are told that the harlot who sits upon the beast and holds in her hands the mystery shall be put to shame, that the weak will rise up again and will render her royal purple and will strip naked her loathsome body. But then I will stand up and point out to thee the 1,000 millions of happy children who have known no sin. And we who have taken their sins upon us for their happiness will stand up before thee and say, Judge us, if thou canst and darest. Know that I fear thee not. Know that I too have been in the wilderness. I too have lived on roots and locusts. I too prize the freedom with which thou hast blessed men, and I too was striving to stand among thy elect, among the strong and powerful, thirsting to make up the number. But I awakened and would not serve madness. I turned back and joined the ranks of those who have corrected thy work. I left the proud and went back to the humble for the happiness of the humble. The similarity between this and the quote we found in Tsiolkovsky is difficult to overlook. Though their motives differ, both he and the Inquisitor, once aware of the advantages they derive from their own strengths and the weakness of others, each in their own way resolved to contribute to humanity's salvation. Yet the saddest part of the Inquisitor's tale is likely that which concerns the reaction of the faithful flock. Even though they witnessed Christ's return through his deeds, even though they see the clear injustice of his imprisonment, they still fall prostrate before the Inquisitor, receiving the blessing of the very man who seeks to banish the truth and the light. We cannot ignore the resemblance between this and the nostalgic reflections on communism, with its public veneration of proven criminals such as Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin or Josip Broz Tito. In the same manner, even after being set free from mind control, most of Monolith's warriors remain faithful, calling upon him to return. Thus, the Inquisitor is not merely a greedy villain, but a man who, for the sake of humanity's happiness, takes the burden upon himself. Here, happiness is placed above freedom and the knowledge of good and evil, that is, above consciousness and choice. Like the inevitable consequence of Frederick Schuchart's wish, the Inquisitor is willing to forego the greatest gift bestowed upon humanity because the price of that gift is unbearable. Naturally, in doing so, he joins the ranks of the proud, convinced of their own exceptionalism and the right to judge reality and decide in the name of others. But let us return to the zone. The three fundamental temptations faced by Christ are mirrored here as well. The fireside conversations reveal that all faction members are haunted by the specter of hunger from which they cannot escape. Despite their proclaimed ideals, all are plagued by doubt, by introspection, and by an unspoken longing for a miracle that might restore their faith in their chosen path. In the end, even in an environment of mortal peril, humankind remains divided, conflicted, and incapable of uniting under a single banner that might transcend tribal organization. And it is precisely in such circumstances that we encounter the sea consciousness as an embodiment of the Grand Inquisitor, and the monolith as a mystery, miracle, and authority. Until the revelations of Doctor and Strelok, no one knows the monolith's origin, its substance, or its purpose. No one knows what lies behind it. It simply is the epicenter of the zone, the physical manifestation of its mystique and secrecy. Besides being a mystery, the monolith is also a miracle worker, at least in the stories told about it. It is the wish granter that beckons the faithful and promises earthly wonders that captivate the human mind. It is also an authority the great monolith invoked in the prayers of its warriors, uniting a scattered human mass into a single operational organism, soothing their thoughts and lifting the burden of freedom and responsibility. Unlike Christ, the sea consciousness takes up Caesar's sword and creates all that man seeks on earth. There is someone to worship, someone to keep his consciousness, and some means of uniting all in one unanimous and harmonious and heap, for the craving for universal unity is the third and last anguish of man. The sea consciousness abolishes free will, not out of malice or lust for power, but from the desire to save humanity. Just like the Inquisitor who condemns to the stake, the sea consciousness sends out warriors to eliminate the unworthy, bearing the burden of that decision alone, at least in principle, for the greater good. Like Christ's temper with whom the Inquisitor stands, it lures the willing with promises of miracles that, as we've seen, end in death or blindness, inviting the curious, metaphorically speaking, to leap from the cliff and see for themselves. In doing so, it removes the inquisitive, and their disappearance leads to the weaving of tales that their wishes came true. Thus, finally, we round off the argument of the monolith as the focal point of meaning. Synthetic, yes, but only in this distorted form can it aspire to universality, and only by removing free will can it be everlasting. But how does the story of the Grand Inquisitor end? Well, with Christ's kiss, a quiet victory of truth and freedom that overcomes the wounded yet stubborn heart of the tormented old man, compelling him to release the prisoner from the dungeon, yet with the warning never to return. This kiss reflects the ideas expressed in the films 2001: A Space Odyssey and Stalker, where both the Star Child and monkey symbolize optimism and the power of human curiosity and intellectual expansion. Similarly, in the game, the genius of the sea consciousness is outmatched by the curiosity of Dr. Strelok and a network of scientists who uncover the truth and, at least partially, shatter their plans. Yet the Inquisitor's warning also reveals something else: the unwavering willpower of an exceptional man who remains faithful to his understanding of the torment of the human condition and the sacrifice he believes is necessary to resolve the tension between order and chaos in the only way he knows. The same perspective should be applied to communism, not merely as a conspiracy of villains, but as a reflection of a genuine desire to save humankind. Although the outcome is the same: death, enslavement, poverty, and deceit, only this latter perspective enables us to truly grasp the challenges we face as a species, largely defined by our own weaknesses. With the previous segment, we reflected on the morality of the struggle for an earthly paradise, the justification of the price at which evil, misery, and suffering might be removed from the world, and the duties that the strong and wise have in the fight for the salvation of all, not just their own souls. The institutionalization of this fight, its framing, and the actions taken to realize it provides a semblance of order and comfort to the masses, but rests on narrowing or removing freedom of choice and reducing the appearance or perception of reality. Such a move is inevitably doomed to fail, as history's abundant examples of institutional decay demonstrate, for reality will inevitably reveal its true scope. I believe most would also agree that this is immoral, considering the sacrifices it demands, regardless of good intentions. While sacrifices are an inevitability of existence, the crucial fact here is that they are not the result of the random movement of Mother Nature, who creates and destroys blindly, but the conscious decision of a few unchosen ones, thus rendering such a state immoral. But beyond theological and ethical concerns, additional problems constrain the mega-projects of salvation or rebirth undertaken by revolutionaries of all colors, leading us to another question: the level of reflection. In this respect, two perspectives previously mentioned regarding the nature of knowledge come into view. On one side stands the basic idea of reflection, knowledge of the existence of knowledge, while on the other lies what Noonan ties to scientists, knowledge of the vastness of ignorance. The difference here is fundamental because of the relationship each creates toward reality, while in the fissure between them lie gaps we are blind to, which carry the danger of total destruction. This brings us to the most speculative part, the concept of the noosphere and the question of the transcendent absolute. It seems to me that the idea of an informational field enveloping the Earth and connected to the thoughts of all living beings is, alongside the atmospheric motif emphasized at the outset, one of the elements that most capture the player's attention. Even though with each new installment of the trilogy it is mentioned less and less, and ever more obliquely. What further draws interest is the fact that, in contrast to the territorial spread of packs and clans, in the case of sea consciousness we witness an effort toward overcoming the previous state of humanity, something that looks like the uploading of consciousness into the very fabric of existence. If we build on what has already been said, such a development, through a combination of coordinating selected minds and controlling the rest, would effectively entail the transmutation of the metaphorical collective body discussed in the segment on factions into a true unification through a collective consciousness operating within the noosphere. In doing so, we also open the question of the fate of sentient beings amid the relentless evolutionary march, in this case toward more complex forms, where instead of territorial expansion and colonization of galaxy, we are presented with transcendence as a result of the search for alternative realities. In both cases, the inspiration stems from the writings and reflections of great thinkers, albeit in altered form. Thus, the noosphere is linked to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Vladimir Vernadsky, though their ideas, rooted in social or ecological abstraction, are transformed in the video game into a vision of a physical layer of information encasing the Earth, tangible, though invisible. On the other hand, we encounter the works of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, whose notions of the transcendence of cosmic intelligence were originally dismissed as mysticism, yet through the strange twist of history eventually gained renewed momentum in theories of singularity and informational transition. In this regard, we can again invoke Teilhard's idea of the omega point as the culmination of noogenesis, which finds support in the conclusions drawn from Tsiolkovsky's panpsychism and his monistic idea of the inevitable unification of individual elements into a complex whole guided by a single will. But to fully grasp all of this, we must revisit Teilhard de Chardin's orthogenetic vision, as well as what we have referred to as the path of cognition. Returning to the three stations that constitute this path, we notice that they reflect two phenomena, quantitative and qualitative ascent. In the first stage, where meaning is seen, we encounter limited gatherings around the manifest, something akin to tribal communities centered on a totem, whose capacity for expansion is confined to a narrow area around their idol. The physical presence of both the idol and the tribe is a prerequisite for the existence of a shared belief system. In the second stage, where meaning is imagined, the idol is displaced from the physical realm, transformed into a more or less fluid abstraction, thereby greatly increasing its reach. Yet the power of the idea is proportional to the strength and spread of its carriers. A physical space in which the idea holds sway must still exist, because although the totem is removed from the observable, the interpreters and believers are not. Finally, we reach the stage where meaning is embodied. Homo sapiens becomes the creator by supposedly transcending physical existence, and his scope becomes potentially boundless as he merges with the reality he weaves and, like the zone itself, expands unstoppably with it. History, however, shows us that this process of increasing complexity and unification also entails an expenditure of energy that results in regression, a breakdown that becomes more dramatic and abrupt the more complex the community is. Yet it appears that there is a kind of pulsation of life, human life in this case, that passes through phases of expansion and contraction, moving toward increasingly complex forms. In that light, it is not enough to point only to reach or extension, but also to a kind of ascent. Viewed from this perspective, the additive power of living matter is shaped by directed complexification, orthogenesis, which leads to both its increasing complexity and its instability or transformation of form. And although we do not observe any significant changes in individual human beings, we can clearly discern qualitative shifts between the tribe in nature, the clan within society, and the sea consciousness within the zone. The transition from one stage to the next implies both an increase in spatial reach and a rise in complexity. Within the world of Stalker, the focus lies primarily on the clans as ideological or operational units within a broader social order situated between a symbolic beginning and a presumed end. On the fringes of their communities lie entities of lesser complexity and narrower scope, the packs. These exist in a pre-tribal stage as we perceive it, lacking any potential for reflection or any need to seek meaning, yet undoubtedly capable of instinctive organization within a broader operational system. Coordinated action here results from natural forces, emerging from random trials and the survival of behavioral mechanisms that produce the best outcomes. There is no reflective consciousness, individuals act on instinct. From time to time, especially near the duty base in Rostock, we witness their unconscious attempts to break through checkpoints and enter human settlements. But there they encounter a force they cannot comprehend, firearms, so they retreat into the spaces between inhabited zones. Their capacities are limited, however dangerous they may be to individual stalkers, and the unconscious order holds as long as the pack leader lives. On the other hand, clans, as entities of higher complexity and wider reach, framed by a broader social order, exist on the periphery of the realm controlled by the sea consciousness. Guided by reflective awareness, they seek to coordinate their efforts through the creation and verbalization of systems of ideas, struggling for the victory of those they consider just. From time to time, they attempt to break through the boundaries and enter the space occupied by the transcendent entity known as the collective consciousness. But there, they encounter a force they cannot comprehend, the Brain Scorcher, and retreat back to the margins, at least until Strelok disables it. Unlike the pack, reflective consciousness allows the protagonist and his associates to interpret this device and overcome the challenge. The waves of discharges, emissions, bear witness to sea consciousness's efforts to cleanse the zone it considers its own, or at the very least to discourage the clans from crossing certain thresholds. It represents a third force, an entity of the highest complexity and reach, capable to some extent of transmuting its own thoughts into physical reality, bypassing the intermediate steps of verbalization and coordination of manifest activity. Thus, we arrive at a sequence where in the background of the landscape lies the realm of unconscious organization, where action is instinctively carried out as a group, shaped primarily by the random forces of nature, the point from which we came. In the foreground lies the realm of conscious organization into active entities, shaped primarily by social forces and ideas, the point at which we currently stand. Finally, all of this is transcended by the realm of the ultimate intelligence, in which human will seemingly overcomes natural forces, the point toward which we are supposedly heading. It becomes clear then that beneath the surface lies the idea that evolution may not be a random sequence of trials producing random outcomes, but rather that there may be a path or even a purpose. And that purpose in the world of Stalker appears as a synthesis, an organization that culminates in unity, which characterizes the point of outcome, or the omega point. As Chardin put it, all our difficulties and repulsions as regards the opposition between the all and the person would be dissipated if only we understood that, by structure, the noosphere, and more generally the world, represent a whole that is not only closed but also centered. Because it contains and engenders consciousness, space-time is necessarily of a convergent nature. Accordingly, its enormous layers, followed in the right direction, must somewhere ahead become involuted to a point which we might call omega, which fuses and consumes them integrally in itself. However immense the sphere of the world may be, it only exists and is finally perceptible in the direction in which its radii meet, even if this were beyond time and space altogether. Better still, the more immense this sphere, the richer and deeper, and hence the more conscious is the point at which the volume of being that it embraces is concentrated. Because the mind, seen from our side, is essentially the power of synthesis and organization, Seen from this point of view, the universe, without losing any of its immensity and thus without suffering any anthropomorphism, begins to take shape. Since to think it, undergo it, and make it act, it is beyond our souls that we must look, not the other way around. In the perspective of a noogenesis, time and space become truly humanized, or rather superhumanized. Far from being mutually exclusive, the universal and personal, that is to say the centered, grow in the same direction and culminate simultaneously in each other. It is therefore a mistake to look for the extension of our being or of the noosphere in the impersonal. The future universal could not be anything else but a hyperpersonal at the omega point. Thus, it would be a mistake to represent omega to ourselves simply as a center born of the fusion of elements which it collects or annihilating them in itself. By its structure, omega, in its ultimate principle, can only be a distinct center radiating at the core of a system of centers, a grouping in which personalization of the all and personalizations of the elements reach their maximum simultaneously and without merging under the influence of a supremely autonomous focus of union. That is the only picture which emerges when we try to apply the notion of collectivity with remorseless logic to a granular whole of thoughts. The process of evolution then culminates in unification into the suprapersonal, gathering around a central point of focus, the final point of unity toward which all living beings strive. The impersonality of the pack-like world and the personality of individual consciousnesses, connected by ideas and actions, evolve into a new mode of being. This is a superconsciousness that integrates whole existence and represents Teilhard de Chardin's attempt to reconcile theology and science. Evolution does not end in entropy and dissipation, but in ultimate intelligence. Although the historical course is marked by the expenditure of energy and decay, what we described with the phrase "the pulsation of life" ultimately leads, despite all hardship, to something greater. For Teilhard, a Jesuit priest, the omega point is synonymous with God, and it is defined by 4 key attributes: autonomy, actuality, irreversibility, and transcendence. First, it is not the origin of evolution. It does not emerge from matter as a property of complexity. On the contrary, like a magnet that precedes it, it draws evolution toward itself. Second, it is not merely an abstract concept but a reality, the actual final state toward which evolution aspires, embodying the fullness of being and consciousness. Third, the movement toward it is irreversible. Once reflective consciousness has arisen, there is no return to instinctual or purely material states. Evolution and the development of consciousness move inexorably forward. Fourth, the omega point transcends physical laws and space-time, existing beyond them. Although it represents the force that draws the arrow of evolution, it, as essence and destination, lies beyond that very arrow. The entire process of evolution in this light can be viewed in 2 ways. First, as a cone composed of a layer of simple atoms at its base, the point of origin, and increasingly narrower parts toward the top representing higher complexity: matter, living organisms, thinking beings, and spirit. Alternatively, it can be seen as a branching structure that begins at alpha in the pre-life phase, expands throughout the zone of life, and then begins to fold in on itself during the phase of reflection, ultimately converging at the omega point in the zone of hyperreflection. In this view, the awakening of living beings, of humans, accompanied by all the doubt, unrest, anxiety, fear, compassion, and so on, compels life to unify into an ultimate intelligence that is neither personal or impersonal, but suprapersonal, and which is guided by the force of love. To cite directly, driven by the force of love, the fragments of the world seek each other so that the world may come into being. We've previously noted that these ideas also find a certain expression in the work of Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. Although a materialist who rejected the intervention of divine elements, the Russian pioneer of astronautics was a proponent of both monism and panpsychism. In the first case, this does not refer merely to the belief that reality is made of a single substance which rejects dualisms like spirit and matter, the living and the non-living, but also to a belief in a general cosmic tendency towards unification, toward oneness. Just as cells join to form a living being with a single center, the brain, Tsiolkovsky believed we could trace a similar unification of humans into a shared, powerful body, a state with a unified government. This leads to the conclusion of the inevitable unification of the Earth and ultimately the entire universe under the control of a superior intelligence. This arises from the aforementioned distinction between sensitivity, which characterizes all matter, and sentience, which emerges in more complex life forms. The movement of atoms thus implies a transition from a dormant to a sensory state, and the very course of cosmic evolutionary development ultimately leads to the universe becoming a conscious entity. The emergence of intelligent life is merely a manifestation of this awakening, while humanity in this framework represents no more than one of the stations on the road to the development of cosmic perfection, with science as its most potent tool. From this follow two beliefs. First, given the space-time dimensions of the cosmos, life undoubtedly fills galactic distances, and it is almost certain that there are complex forms of intelligent life far beyond humanity. Second, from all that has been said, one can also speculate about a kind of material immortality, reincarnation, or persistence. Since matter and consciousness are eternal and interconnected, individual personalities may endure in altered forms even after death. The continual survival of the atoms from which we are composed, their merging into sentience and dispersing into dormant sensitivity, may serve as a guarantee of that. But the question remains, why would any of this be relevant to the world of Stalker? My belief is that the very combination of ideas outlined above, which provides one possible answer to the Fermi paradox, may also offer an answer to the question, where is the sea consciousness? As disappointing as it may be, the answer for now can only be that its space-temporal location is unknowable at our current stage of development, and naturally at the current stage of all other agents in Stalker. Even though we see Strelok at the end of Shadow of Chernobyl emptying his magazine, methodically executing the physical bodies of the scientists who originally made up the sea consciousness, the same character tells us in Call of Pripyat that the people responsible for the Wish-Granter illusion are somewhere else. He speaks in terms of space as we understand it, but the monolith itself is a monument to the Omega Point, a point of unification, or, in the language of transcendent intelligent life, a point of transition. The sea consciousness exists. It is one with the zone, which represents a mode of unified being in development, as evidenced by the emissions that function like an immune response. It is, simply put, an evolutionary leap that has created a new form of humanity. The technical details about the machines that brought this about remain untouched, aside from the image of the pods containing the scientists and the EEG-like electrodes attached to their heads. And while I agree that a deeper explanation of the machinery behind this process would be more than fascinating, I also believe its absence does not diminish the experience. What matters is that transition, that is, the transcendence, has taken place. What is confusing, however, is the issue of the zone's expansion, which must be sought in subtext. For example, the barkeeper relays a rumor that every time the Wish-Granter answers someone's prayers, the zone expands by 5 kilometers. Of course, based on Strelok's fate when approaching the Wish-Granter, we see that sometimes he disappears, sometimes he is absorbed as energy, and sometimes he dies, so it remains unclear what exactly is happening. Moreover, we are told by a representative of the sea consciousness that their intention is to prevent further expansion of the zone. The existence of the Wish-Granter as a bait, luring the curious to fuel the zone's growth, is therefore at odds with what they claim, especially given that we know it is their creation. Naturally, we have no reason to trust them, particularly given the fact that they operate from the shadows and willingly enslave and mentally condition stalkers. This is followed by warnings about the expansion of the zone in Duty's propaganda, which in itself is countered by the random discussions of its members, questioning this narrative. Yet, judging by the Stalker 2 trailer Enter the Zone, it seems that it is in fact expanding. Be that as it may, if we accept the concept of the Omega Point, the supposed endpoint of the evolutionary path, which for Teilhard de Chardin is synonymous with God, we can observe that the sea consciousness in its transcendent form satisfies the defining characteristics of that concept. First, It is autonomous, not simply the product of evolution, but a magnetic force that redirects the spontaneous development of life and humanity into a consciously constructed evolutionary path. Mutated creatures, mind control, and the phase transition, all of these are evolutionary phenomena, but as the result of human interference rather than the will of Mother Nature or divine intention. Second, the sea consciousness is actual, no longer just an idea of the ultimate intelligence, but the ultimate intelligence itself, shaping events within the zone. It is the puppet master behind the scenes, steering lives either directly, as in the case of the monolith soldiers, or indirectly through environmental manipulation. Third, the transition from physical to transcendent existence is irreversible, unidirectional. No matter how often people speak of destroying the zone, it never happens. Even the destruction of the group's capsules changes nothing. Although we see Strelok lying in the grass and enjoying the comfort of a regular reality, Call of Pripyat shows us that there is no going back. Finally, the sea consciousness transcends the physical laws as we know them and exists within a reality that lies beyond our comprehension. Space-time distortions in which stalkers disappear, the conclusion that the scientists are somewhere else, emissions and wormholes that serve as teleportational anomalies, as well as anomalies in general, all of this tells us that sea consciousness is a completely new reality beyond the coordinates we are used to, which seeks to shape evolution. That is, with the phase transition, people are no longer just its product, but become its creators. From our narrow perspective, this transcendent mind appears as a god in the making, seemingly capable of commanding the skies and the earth. And yet, as impressive as the leap may seem, our conversation with its representative reveals that the zone is, in fact, a mistake rather than intention, and that life, though at a higher level, remains just that, life. This confirms that even a supposed deity, like everything else, can only be defined relatively and referentially. Thus, God from our perspective may be no more than an ant from the vantage point of a higher deity. The sea consciousness, the creator of the zone, the mighty source of energy surges that set the skies ablaze and make the ground tremble, appears scattered in its efforts to control the noosphere, incapable of stopping even a well-organized network of agents from reaching the heart of this alien world and discovering the pods that hold the scientists. The omega point of Homo sapiens' evolution is nothing more than the alpha point of a new world inhabited by the successors of its species. The two are in truth one and the same, and all ideas about the final station on the evolutionary path fall apart, while the path itself stretches on into infinity. This inverts the perspective, in contrast to the orthogenetic vision in which evolutionary development is seen as a progression driven by some inner, a priori force or logic. We are presented with humans who, by creating ideas and narratives about the existence of a goal or logic in development, undertake actions that operate like self-fulfilling prophecies. Through their ideas, they generate the inner force of progression. By speaking of a deity as Alpha and Omega, they step out of the stream of aimless, random evolution and enter the space of creation, becoming themselves a kind of pseudo-god, the beginning and the end of a new evolutionary current, the ultimate will or intelligence. We can even draw a parallel with the evolutionary continuity emphasized in the segment dedicated to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and suggest that the intellectual montage, from the shot of a bone being thrown into the air to that of the spacecraft floating through cosmos, finds its counterpart in the passage through the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which leads us to the capsules containing the members of the group. Both are tools through which humanity seeks to assert control over earthly forces and ease the burden of existence, and both represent forces that ultimately slip from its grasp due to its own inherent weaknesses, however we choose to interpret them. And it is precisely this new being that creates the zone, grim, convoluted, deadly, yet full of wonder and potential. It creates it in its own image, for how can one create a world without paradox or evil when both dwell within us? We have already seen this in the section devoted to the clans and in the film's commentary, where the guide notes that the human mind is the catalyst for anomalies. Even at that level of cognitive and technological development, the idealized divine height remains beyond reach. But how is that possible? Although the equation becomes more complex here, the answer remains essentially the same as in the previous chapter. With the development of reflective thought, man becomes aware of good and evil. On the other hand, by transcending physical existence, he becomes immortal, or so it seems given Strelok's failure to destroy the sea consciousness. Yet one aspect of the divine formula remains inaccessible to him: the ability to always choose good over evil. This remains impossible even when transcendence overcomes the earlier mentioned issues of differing interpretations of the same ideals, verbalization of ideas, and coordination of actions. Thus, the zone as a mirror of the human soul or mind, as portrayed in the film, takes on form within the game as well. However, this impossibility stems not only from the corrupt nature of humanity, but also from man's inability to comprehend phenomena in all their complexity or to calculate the consequences of various actions, both prerequisites for any planned reality. Ideals, just like any form of divinity, remain knowable only in a relative referential sense. As such, absolute good or evil captivate the mind as concepts, but remain elusive as empirical phenomena. The fate of humanity continues, and the darkness of the cosmos remains unscathed, let alone diminished. As with our historical experience, the actions undertaken by the sea consciousness liberate it from the burden imposed by nature, while simultaneously making it dependent on the newly established system. One determinism is replaced by another, and therefore Omega, as previously said, can be nothing more than the alpha of a new phase. As agriculture once freed humans from constant movement and uncertain hunting success, paving the way for population booms and the rise of civilization, it also bound them to the land, to the hard labor of cultivation and the bureaucratic state structures necessary for massive irrigation projects. In the same way, the sea consciousness, despite all its excesses, becomes ensnared in the effort to close the rift in the noosphere while also trying to fend off the curious explorers whose probing only exacerbates its existence. In offering a solution to previous afflictions, it creates new ones it must contend with. This, of course, does not mean that everything is an illusion, that no progress exists. On the contrary, but it does mean that there is no end, and that utopia is only magical so long as it remains an idea. It means that there is no divine spirit, prime mover, or predetermined end to dictate the rhythm of progress, only man with his ideas, knowledge, ignorance, ethics, and perversions. Once the idea enters the phase of realization, disillusionment sets in and the vast gulf between ambitions and capabilities becomes apparent. Yet this too opens up a whole array of ethical questions shaped by everything we've said so far. Thus, within the framework of this evolutionary leap, a central dilemma emerges. Is a morally acceptable form of unanimity possible on the path towards the elevation of consciousness? After all, the endpoint of monism, as we've described it, inherently demands the eventual emergence of such a state. How many readers then would be surprised by the following quote from a letter addressed to Tsiolkovsky regarding the contents of his work? You are a materialist in your conclusions and investigations, and in your monism you are very much aligned with us, the communists, who are also monists in the sphere of social relations and economics. Of course, the fact that one reader observes this similarity in no way implicates Tsiolkovsky or Teilhard de Chardin for that matter. The latter, given the time in which he wrote, was fully aware of the problem of totalization that arises from what he perceived as noogenesis. He even notes that there has never been a historical period in which humanity was so well equipped and ready to organize its multiplicity, only to be faced with the glaring lessons of Nazism and communism, which clearly demonstrated the process of entrapment. So we get the crystal instead of the cell, the anthill instead of brotherhood. Instead of the upsurge of consciousness which we expected, it is mechanization that seems to emerge inevitably from totalization. However, he does not consider such outcomes a reason to abandon the process. Rather, he asserts that the tragedy of totalitarianism lies in its having distorted something magnificent while being so close to the truth. The only crucial difference, he argues, is that the work of the great human machine must not be reduced solely to material production, but must generate a superabundance of mind. Nevertheless, the communist experience remains relevant, not only due to its attempts at establishing mental uniformity or because of the earlier quoted enthusiastic reader. Guided by an eschatological belief in the inevitability of utopia, all communist movements undertook concrete actions that resulted in consequences antithetical to their proclaimed ideals. Here too, the imagined end goal, as a telos necessarily emerging from what was recognized as the logic of historical development, fed activity and gave rise to communism, not because it was inevitable, but because its adherents believed it to be and did everything in their power to bring it about. Of course, one might always ask why act at all if the outcome is already a necessary consequence of the flow of history. And yet, the depth of their conceptual error is made even more evident by the fact that those disillusioned by past failures, as well as many enthusiasts today, never gave up their belief that true communism had never been tried, privileging fantasy over concrete experience. What had been lived through was thus interpreted as nothing more than a deviation from the ideal, a betrayal of the revolution or the birth pangs of a new world. Such a worldview gave rise and still gives rise to the oft-used justification that cloaks its inherent cruelty or the callousness of self-proclaimed genius in naive poeticism. The idea that you have to break a few eggs to make an omelette. If we reduce the argument to the rawest emotional level using visceral response as our ethical compass, we might say that even some revolutionaries who ended up on the garbage heap of history came to feel that such a metaphor only sounds acceptable until the eggs being broken become you and your loved ones. And while we're on the subject of metaphors, it's worth noting that every omelette only satisfies hunger for a time. Soon, new eggs must be laid on the altar of an eternally ravenous appetite. Revolution, like the zone, consumes until the very end. Still, that hasn't stopped some exceptional individuals from preemptively justifying the sacrifices they knew would be inevitable on the ascent toward the grandeur they envisioned. So let us return to Tsiolkovsky. Let us say that a strange genius appears in a country, one whom the majority cannot understand due to the lofty nature of his ideas. That genius is like a man among apes. A great chasm separates him from the masses. He is invisible to the people and thus he cannot be elected by them. But a few understand him. They are convinced that he is humanity's salvation. That small group begins to rule a small state and then several states. They are ruthless, marked by all kinds of violence. But being convinced of their own righteousness and benevolence, they feel no shame in breaking common laws and conventional morality. 90% of the population does not understand them and therefore suffers violence, not moving forward by its own will, but through fear, threats, and suffering. Could something like this happen in life? It is possible, though it may end in ruin if the minority fails to overcome the majority and bring them to its side. Such an organization could last a long time. The shepherd strikes his flock with a whip to save it from hunger, cold, and predators. The flock cannot overthrow the shepherd. Ecce ille inquisitor magnus. Behold the grand inquisitor. Behold the benefactor of mankind. Conventional morality, lashes of the whip and salvation. What pregnant words spoken, it seems, so easily. Here we encounter a problem that rises from the aforementioned levels of reflection. Simply put, no one can dispute the genius of either Tsiolkovsky or Teilhard de Chardin. But the question we must always keep in mind is, what if on the road to the Omega Point, the Lightbringer intervenes? Not as a villain, we expect nothing good from that sort, but as an extraordinary individual who illuminates the way, though his light shines over a pitifully small portion of the surrounding darkness, always in danger of being overwhelmed by it. Both forward and back, its reach remains limited. Even if the beam is intensified, the focus must be narrowed, leaving us with a metaphor for the drop of knowledge in the ocean of ignorance. What if two or more unusual geniuses appear who agree on what they see, but not on what to do? And what if, on top of that, a decision must be made quickly, requiring knowledge to be translated into action with all the limitations we've discussed? What, ultimately, if the genius and the few who understand him make a catastrophic mistake that costs everyone, not just themselves. So the issue is not only evil, but the structure of reality itself and the inherent impossibility of achieving absolute knowledge or of resolving the tension between order and chaos. Teilhard de Chardin believed that if there is a future for mankind, it can only be imagined in terms of a harmonious constellation of what is free with what is planned and totalized. But in the game we see that the pessimism of the Strugatsky brothers ultimately prevails. Pessimism born from both deep contemplation and the practical experience of various totalization experiments. The attempt to resolve the tension between order and chaos through the evolution of consciousness also collapses, given that the reality is practically infinite and no mind can encompass it fully. Thus, the very thing described in the segment on Limansk and the experiment inevitably occurs. Omega becomes everything at the cost of other lives. Its survival becomes both Alpha and Omega, even if that means erasing free will through mental control and enforce unanimity. The zone devours, enslaves, and spreads, but rather than uniting into a suprapersonal entity, it, save for the few chosen, returns to impersonality. In the end, we do not get the Omega as an absolute God, but remain with a relative and referential divinity. C consciousness is a Gnostic demiurge, the creator of the world, the son of Sophia, of knowledge or wisdom, who creates an imperfect world in his own imperfect image. Like the God of the Old Testament, he leaves humans in ignorance, bound to material reality, punishing their attempts to attain knowledge. Unlike the benefactors of humanity in the film, who would use the room as a divine gift, the benefactors in the game create the wish granter themselves, like parents offering a glittering lie to keep their children distracted while they work. Like the black monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which functions as an evolutionary module, a creator or even controller of the simulation, the monolith in Stalker represents the manifestation of humanity's evolutionary leap from product of spontaneous flow to architect of planned development. The mind, as a product of spontaneous evolution, becomes convinced that it is a part of a greater developmental plan and begins to act accordingly, thus transforming itself into the architect of that very plan. C consciousness becomes the black monolith of 2001: A Space Odyssey. With this, we circle back to the monolith as a point of evolutionary transition, an Omega that is not an end but the beginning of a new struggle and new determinisms that must be overcome. Life remains life, even in its superior form. Having dealt with the not-so-absolute transcendent absolute, we can now turn to the concept of the noosphere, which culminates in the Omega. This is a particularly tricky subject given that the creators of the video game chose to translate an abstract concept into something tangible without offering clarification on its nature or essence. As described, the idea, originally tied to a socio-ecological abstraction, is reimagined in the game as a physical layer of information enveloping the Earth, connected to the thoughts of all living beings with cognitive capacities. Attempts to influence the noosphere result in a rupture, which manifests as the zone in the observable world. Judging by the statement from the representative of the C consciousness, as well as the aforementioned trailer for the second installment of Stalker, this rupture is expanding and the agents of the ultimate intelligence are allegedly trying to prevent such an outcome. If we were to tackle this problem head-on, I don't believe we'd get very far. Yet, as before, indirect inference may aid our interpretation. But to proceed in that way, it is important to first revisit the original idea of the noosphere. A look into Teilhard de Chardin's thoughts reveals that he employs it as an abstraction encompassing a developmental stratum on the tree of life, itself a metaphor or a conceptual model for exploring the evolution of living beings and describing the relationship between organisms. Naturally, everything presented so far implies that, within an orthogenetic vision, this tree is not merely a model of descent or kinship, but of development aiming toward a particular goal. Thus, for Teilhard, the emergence of thought and its progression marks the birth of a new member in that evolutionary sequence. Let us quote directly. Psychogenesis has led to man. Now it effaces itself, relieved or absorbed by another and a higher function, the engendering and subsequent development of the mind, in one word, noogenesis. The recognition and isolation of a new era in evolution, the era of noogenesis, obliges us to distinguish correlatively a support proportionate to the operation, that is to say, yet another membrane in the majestic assembly of telluric layers. A glow ripples outward from the first spark of conscious reflection. The point of ignition grows larger. The fire spreads in ever-widening circles, till finally the whole planet is covered with incandescence. Only one interpretation, only one name can be found worthy of this grand phenomena. Much more coherent and just as extensive as any preceding layer, it is really a new layer, the thinking layer, which, since its germination at the end of tertiary period, has spread over and above the world of plants and animals. In other words, outside and above the biosphere, there is the noosphere. Its culmination, as previously explained, is represented by the omega point. On the other hand, Vernadsky approaches this question from the perspective of geological forces, just as he views the biosphere as region of transformers that convert cosmic radiation into active energy in electrical, chemical, mechanical, thermal, and other forms. So too does he consider the evolutionary process to have given rise to a new geological force, that is, the scientific thought of humankind. Under the influence of scientific thought and human labor, the biosphere transitions into a new state, the noosphere. Consciousness then becomes a driving force of geological change. That is, with the emergence of the human species, the biosphere infinitely amplifies its geological power and transforms into the noosphere. Humanity drains swamps, bridges canyons, irrigates deserts, and fills the atmosphere with exhaust gases. Its footprint is visible from space, as city lights at night, like incidental manifestation of civilization, trace the contours of urban areas and the networks that connect them. The noosphere rests upon and reshapes both the biosphere and the geosphere. Given such a spectacular impact on the planet, and in an effort to conceptually encompass it, the term Anthropocene gradually emerged to describe the geological epoch we inhabit. And though debates continue over the validity of that designation, Vernadsky's pioneering work has found its affirmation in the very way scientists now reflect on the planetary consequences of human social structures and of humanity as a whole. Without delving further into the development of the concept, it becomes clear that, aside from its name, the noosphere in the world of Stalker diverges significantly from its original conceptualization. One could argue, however, that by embracing the idea of the sea consciousness as a manifestation of a phase transition and the attainment of the omega point, along with the effects it produces on the physical structure of the geosphere, the mental activity of a segment of the biosphere, and the general emergence of anomaly fields or wormholes, we arrive at a synthesis of the ideas of the two aforementioned thinkers. The fusion of the zone and the sea consciousness, as a noosphere culminating in omega, becomes the force of the reconfiguration of reality. Be that as it may, an additional link emerges, one found in the themes of utopia and the role of science. In this sense, Vernadsky aligns with Chardin and Tsiolkovsky, finding in centralized coordination and the systematic application of science a cure for humanity's ailments and a path toward a brighter future. As he put it, through scientific thought and state-organized directed technology, humanity creates in the biosphere a new biogenic force which steers its reproduction and establishes favorable conditions for populating those parts of the biosphere where not only humans but, at times, no living species had ever dwelt. Naturally, this brings up the question of maximizing efficiency, to which Vernadsky responds with the idea of a universal state, thus echoing the motif of unity, whether in Teilhard's or Tsiolkovsky's sense, as well as the Caesar sword rejected by Christ but longed for by the Grand Inquisitor. In his own words, the idea of a unified political community of all humankind is becoming a reality only in our time, and even now merely as a realistic ideal whose fulfillment should not be doubted. It is clear that the realization of such unity is a necessary condition for the organization of the noosphere, and humanity will inevitably bring it about. Of course, such thoughts cannot be held against him, but from our perspective, once again, it is quite clear that the cost of centralization, which is a prerequisite for any form of universalism accessible to human capacities, is far too high. Vernadsky saw in science a positive potential, even though he acknowledged that it had been used for evil as well. What troubled him most was its fragmentation and subordination to narrow interests, as opposed to the cosmic heights to which it rightfully belongs. He found inspiration in utopian thinking, fully aware of the tension between the value of scientists for individual states and the necessity for their global organization. To quote, "Awareness of the fundamental importance of science for the good of humanity, of its immense power for both good and evil, is gradually and irreversibly transforming the scientific circles. Even in utopias, including ancient Hellenic ones like Plato's, state power was concentrated in the hands of scientists, a notion expressed to greater or lesser degrees in the vast majority of utopias. But the real increase in the state's valuation of scientists, which we can now observe, has had a strong impact on their scientific organization and is changing public opinion within the scientific community. This means that science often finds itself in the role of a handmaid tasked with serving the narrow interests of a particular community or party, directed toward goals shamefully misaligned with its true potential. Similar concerns also haunted Teilhard, who stated that the truth is that, as children of a transition period, we are neither fully conscious of nor in full control of the new powers that have been unleashed. Clinging to outworn habits, we still see in science only a new means of providing more easily the same old things. We put Pegasus between the traces, and Pegasus languishes unless he bolts with the wagon. But a moment will come, it is bound to, when man will be forced by disparity of the equipage to admit that science is not an accessory occupation for him, but an essential activity, a natural derivative of the overspill of energy constantly liberated by mechanization. It is impossible not to recognize the truth in these words, at least in the part that pertains to the depiction of our present. It's impossible not to feel a pang of sympathy when we see dubious figures parading through the public sphere, consciously or not offered to us as ideals by which we're expected to measure our own lives. And in contrast, we see brilliant minds in state institutions miserably underpaid and often forced to engage in meaningless work justified by the mystical veil of state reason or national interest. This becomes all the more tragic when we consider the silent evidence of a sea of brilliant minds who never even came close to appearing on our radar, let alone being recognized because they had to compromise simply to survive. How much more painful it becomes when we encounter a metaphor as beautiful as that of Pegasus hitched to a plow. And so, can we really blame the sea consciousness whose representative states that they immediately took control of those conducting the experiment and began with their own organization?
We immediately subordinated those who were conducting the experiment and assigned them to tasks we needed them to carry out.
This is a genuinely difficult question. Is it not justifiable for the most intelligent to govern? How can a fool pass judgment on a genius? Is it fair for their voices to carry equal weight? Can the average person truly appreciate a groundbreaking discovery that raises more questions than it answers, but heralds a shift in paradigm? We witnessed just such a moment at the very beginning of the roadside picnic, when a journalist questions Professor Pillman about the visit and the most important discovery scientists have made since it occurred. The shallow worldview that defines the journalist renders him incapable of grasping the depth of the professor's answer.
The fact of the visit is not only the most important discovery of the last 13 years, it's the most important discovery in human history. It doesn't matter who these aliens were. Doesn't matter where they came from, why they came, why they left so quickly, or where they vanished to since. What matters is that we now know for sure humanity is not alone in the universe. I'm afraid the Institute of Extraterrestrial Cultures could never make a more fundamental discovery.
In his response, the journalist immediately leaps to the question of the practical, turning to potential technological discoveries that could benefit humanity, citing a number of prominent experts who allegedly support that view. Notice the stark difference in perspective. While the professor's words shatter the anthropocentric worldview, concluding that the greatest question or burden of humanity, namely its cosmic uniqueness, has likely been resolved, his interlocutor's outlook remains shallowly tethered to humankind, seeking ways to profit from the event, identifying potential new methods of satisfying human needs as a more spectacular discovery than one that upends the entire previous paradigm. This same affliction is just as visible in the Zone, where few stop to reflect upon its mystery or seemingly magical environment. Instead, people enter it either in pursuit of profit or in service of ideological goals. The sea consciousness is fully aware of this and thus creates the wish granter as an illusion that we, our desires and needs, are at the center of reality. This is why its calls are so powerful, insisting on our specialness, as noted earlier, stating that there can be only one, someone exceptional who deserves the reward, and that true fulfillment has a specific place and moment of realization.
Иди ко мне. Ты обретешь то, что заслуживаешь.
The same applies to the golden sphere in the novel. At the heart of a grand phenomenon and the vastness of our ignorance stands the belief that its appearance exists solely to fulfill our wishes. The narrowness of practicality, like necessity, or the doom born of the need to survive, can act as a cage for thought, restraining humanity's greatest tool. When looking at the Zone, we also see a striking contrast between the position of the sea consciousness and that of the scientists in the field. The former, having gained the freedom they sought, are now steering an evolutionary phase transition, a feat so spectacular that it can appear as nothing short of magic to the average stalker or even to us. The latter, meanwhile, are in part forced to work in service of the shallow needs of clans and mercenaries who supply them with artifacts in exchange for better equipment. Is this not the very rift between Pegasus, who has broken free, rising into heights the common man cannot follow, and the one still plowing, compelled to pay for his oats with labor painfully misaligned with his true potential? And now it seems we've arrived at a paradox. We initially defended practicality only to shift our perspective and stand in defense of thinkers. But the paradox is only apparent, for we have consistently insisted on one and the same point. There is no final answer. Things are relative, complex, and painted in shades of grey. And I believe we have shown that the game insists on this too. If anything has become evident in all we've said so far, it's that Stalker does not offer easy answers, nor does it align itself hastily with any side. It raises questions and contemplates human existence in all its anguish and beauty. It portrays the tension between order and chaos in all its forms, without attempting to resolve it, for it knows, just like the Strugatsky brothers, that there is no resolution. So, as exceptional, gifted, and skeptical as Dr. Pillman may be, he is still not the embodiment of some pure entity we might call science. There are countless differences among the many individuals engaged in research, whose collective activity forms what we call science, but who themselves are merely knots within a far more intricate web that is humanity, inseparably integrated into it. That is why Pillman expresses his doubt in a later conversation with Noonan, pointing to all the negative consequences of venturing into the Zone and working with its artifacts and anomalies, along with the uncertain benefits and the potential for misuse. For though he notes that many artifacts have been placed in the service of humankind, their true depth remains beyond our understanding.
We've found many marvels. In a number of cases, we've even learned how to adapt these marvels to our needs. We've even gotten used to them. A lab monkey presses a red button and gets a banana, presses a white button and gets an orange, but has no idea how to obtain bananas or oranges without buttons. Nor does it understand the relationship between buttons and oranges and bananas.
There is no quick answer to the questions we've raised about justice or the rightness of action. Yet we face an additional problem evident in the response of the representative of the sea consciousness. Their perspective remains deeply anthropocentric. No matter how much we might criticize the shallowness of the common man, his obsession with bread and soil, the very idea that we have the right to judge empirical reality and strive to alter it reveals the essence of anthropocentrism. Everything the sea consciousness identifies as negative and in need of removal burdens each of us personally, but the ambition itself reflects a worldview in which we, our desires and needs, our thoughts and understanding are placed at the center of existence. We will not adapt to the universe, but rather change it. It is necessary to recognize then that even in our most abstract questions, moral judgments often dominate, and these are inevitably measured by the profoundly subjective standard of humanness. At the same time, such ambition or arrogance also stems from centralization, which eliminates self-questioning and cultivates an unwarranted sense of power. At that point, awareness of the depths of our ignorance is inevitably weakened, and attention shifts toward what is known, a result of the demand for action that accompanies centralization. If we reflect on the Platonic ideal that Vernadsky invokes, we see that through centralization and the transition from a sphere of free intellectual activity to the one of power and organization, the grandeur of the individual mind, which dazzles in comparison to any one person, becomes disproportionately small once it reaches the summit of the social body. It begins to get lost in the organization of its elements, let alone in understanding and influencing all the complexities of the world. This is when the pressure arises to reconcile the chaos of free thought and conflicting perspectives with the order of conformity and temporary efficiency. And if we follow the Strugatsky brothers, it becomes clear that this dilemma tends to be resolved in favor of the latter, order and control. The initially heightened efficiency or semblance of order is ultimately paid for with a loss through rigidity, the suppression of uncensored innovation, the stifling of associative freedom and creativity, which through the sea of trial, error, luck and accident give rise to discoveries that a centralized system is fundamentally incapable of producing. For centralization cannot encompass what we previously described as tacit knowledge, knowledge that arises from accumulated empirical experience, free from theorizing. In fact, it often happens that an excessive reliance on theoretical constructs leads directly to the problem of the Procrustean bed, that empirical reality gets trimmed, squeezed and reshaped to fit our concepts. And when you've dedicated your whole life to building a hammer, every problem starts to look like a nail. Thus, only a mind that does not overestimate its own capacities and is connected with a network of other free minds becomes sustainable in the long term, even if some energy is inevitably lost to procedures and formalities. In fact, it doesn't even matter whether individual capacities are overestimated. Organizing as a network limits the consequences of error, which is bound to occur, by creating a multitude of nodes capable of continuing the work if others fail or fall. In this way, it simulates what we previously described as blind groping in the dark, the very method through which life finds its way. Of course, in the case of science, this groping is not entirely blind. The categorical apparatus it relies on acts as a set of torches with which the light-bringers illuminate at least part of the path ahead. With this, we once again flip the perspective and stand in defense of naming as a form of classification, something Frederick Schuchart criticizes when reflecting on Kero. For as long as naming is not absolutized by forbidding opposing beliefs, it remains one of the most powerful tools humanity possesses. In the words of Stephen Jay Gould, classifications are not passive ordering devices in a world objectively divided into obvious categories. Taxonomies are human decisions imposed upon nature theories about the cause of nature's order. The chronicle of historical changes in classification provides our finest insight into conceptual revolutions in human thought. Objective nature does exist, but we can converse with her only through the structure of our taxonomic system. Terms like Gravai concentrate thus play a crucial role in our communication with reality. Whether we're referring to the aforementioned tree of life or the periodic table of elements, classifications as expressions of naming are extraordinarily powerful tools. The problem then does not lie in naming itself, but in the potential confusion between the map and the terrain, a confusion tied both to the demand that knowledge be translatable into action and to questions of power, risk, and the conditions of free, spontaneous interaction. In a diffuse system of power and responsibility, my mistake does not have to cost others, or at least not too much, whereas in a centralized structure, the errors of those in control cost us all, especially if those in power begin with the belief in a single correct path or a predetermined outcome of history and then proceed not to test their convictions, but to seek confirmation for them. Thus, in contrast to the sea consciousness, which reshapes the world according to its will, resonating with the ideas of the omega point and the noosphere as the enhancement of the biosphere, and by extension the geosphere, we find a network of scientific units and other agents like Strelok who adapt to the zone, that is, who evolved. The former claim to know what is right, the latter question and discover. And so, after the physical layer of information and the ultimate intelligence embedded in the zone, we arrive at the third, least obvious manifestation of the noosphere: the globalization of science, the nature of research grounded in collaboration and the development of shared terminology, and the institutionalization of knowledge production. All of these are manifestations of the noosphere, echoed in the network of research installations through which the game's protagonists move and with whom they cooperate to find solutions to the challenges the zone presents. But let us return to the question of organization and flexibility. Around the first hour and 7th minute of the movie Stalker, we hear the guide's reflection on hardness and softness. At one point, he states that hardness and strength are death's companions, while softness and weakness express the freshness of being, concluding that what has hardened will never win. These words stand in direct contrast to the Soviet propaganda which, from depictions of heroic workers to its glorification of heavy industry and the leader, exalted hardness and strength. Of course, the line itself can be read as a marker of dissident sentiment, but it also serves our argument. It is precisely the rigidity of the Soviet order which undoubtedly produced both coordinated science and impressive technological advances that acts here as a warning. It is no coincidence that the Chernobyl power plant was chosen as the epicenter of the zone. Combined with the limitations of perspective and the caution we offered earlier regarding the astronauts in 2001: A Space Odyssey, the danger of a rational being believing that what is available to its senses is all, or at least most of what exists, we are reminded to always ask, who uses science and for what purpose? This brings us back to the internal logic of the Soviet Union, which, at least for a time, aspired to become a universal state. For Vernadsky, this wasn't a concern. He expressed unwavering faith in humanity's destined ascent, one he believed science could achieve, while setting aside the question of how societies or groups might use that same science for purposes he would never condone. Preserving power, amassing material wealth, developing more efficient methods of extermination, enslaving humans or animals, and, no less importantly, exploiting natural resources and devastating the environment. Our lived experience seems to show that the faith Vernadsky expressed has not been justified even within liberal democracies, let alone under totalitarian regimes. If we return to the fundamentals, we might say that anyone familiar with Marx's work would notice that he too, like many of the thinkers mentioned thus far, frequently invoked the terms scientific and rational. He believed in the cognitive capacities of the human species, in the power of reason, and emphasized knowledge and education. And yet every system that, at least declaratively, drew inspiration from his thought ended up producing the same result. Not free thought, but dogma, not science as humanity's torch, but science as the handmaiden of power. We've already seen in the section of mind control research how easily curiosity and scientific inquiry can be channeled into fantasies or ambitions of mastering the mechanisms of population control. At times, the development of so-called Soviet science even took on absurd forms, like the case of Trofim Denisovich Lysenko, who rejected bourgeois and promoted proletarian biology, supposedly rooted in Marxist theory of class struggle. Among the consequences of his influence were the arrest and death of the geneticist Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov, as well as the devastation of Soviet biology and agriculture. If we return to Tsiolkovsky's metaphor of cells merging into a unified whole under a single center, the brain, we might say that just as the brain, in its craving for glucose, can send signals that lead to sugar overconsumption and the destruction of the rest of the organism, so too does a centrally governed state tend to satisfy the needs of its governing core, regardless of the cost paid by the rest of the community. Though the Soviet Union was capable of transforming the former Russian Empire, leading it, as the phrase goes, from the plow to the nuclear reactor, it also starved and enslaved an uncountable sea of its own people, not to mention the additional suffering brought on by bureaucratization and chronic shortages of consumer goods. Ultimately, it was the fear of power and the conspiracy of silence driven by the dread of political consequences that led to the Chernobyl disaster. But we must not forget the role that underestimation of the danger played as a significant factor in the unfolding of events. Despite prior experiences with partial core meltdowns in other RBMK reactors, and despite the awareness of the dangers posed by the positive void coefficient and the flawed shutdown system, the infamous AZ5 button, many scientists, including Valery Alexeyevich Legasov, who would later present the results of the disaster investigation to the International Atomic Energy Agency, underestimated how catastrophic these problems could be. In the same way, the sea consciousness, in its effort to cleanse the noosphere of negative factors, shortly after subjugating the experimenters went down the path of subjugating others as well, not to mention the deadly nature of the zone in general and the evil that the race for artifacts brings out in people. The group, formed in conspiratorial conditions within a system which lacked mechanisms of control and accountability separated from party affiliation, driven by its own ambitions, produced a catastrophe that no one else can help resolve, nor does it allow anyone to come close to the truth about the nature and the origin of the zone. Overestimating its own capabilities, the group underestimated the potential for catastrophic outcomes. On the other hand, roadside picnic stands in contrast to all ideas of the human species' grandeur, functioning as a critique of the rupture expressed by humanists and Enlightenment thinkers, calling for caution through questioning, and the game shares this sentiment. Beneath the surface of the novel lies a deep pessimism which, even if it recognizes something grand in humanity, finds it merely in its ability to survive. But, as we have said, it fundamentally questions the value of consciousness or reason. Thus, we too might freely consider them as just one of many elements of evolutionary adaptation and point to their potentially negative adaptive value, taking into account the damage they cause. Humans, as a geological force, destroy forests and animal life, spill oil into oceans, and scatter garbage they don't know how to dispose of. They unleash the power of the atom not only to provide hospitals and schools with electricity, but also to annihilate enemies with ever-present risk of technical failures and unintended consequences arising from systemic rigidity or closed structures. The sea consciousness, as a geological force, dreams of celestial heights but creates a zone of catastrophe and death. Comparing humanity with turtles or crocodiles, one might say that, though they do not know of good and evil, they have existed for hundreds of millions of years, while our species has only just scraped together about 300,000, constantly on the brink of self-destruction. Perhaps it's dangerous to question the adaptive value of reflective consciousness, no matter the anguish it produces, for it seems to act as a spark of the divine within each of us. Still, it's crucial to recall the second level of reflection, the awareness of the scale of our ignorance, which can serve as a corrective factor. Aside from this reminder, however, the question always arises of whether there exists a more formal approach to preserving humanity, or at least to reducing the space for catastrophic error. The answer might be found in decentralization, as opposed to the universal state and unified science, in the third version of the noosphere that we see in the game, a network of scientific institutions and actors supported by the strength or zeal of adventurers. In contrast to a central mind, individual actors need not know everything, and both capacity and risk remain distributed. Knowledge exists as a consequence of the sum of diverse perspectives, focuses, or interests. The destruction of one node does not spell death for all. The impact of error remains limited, unlike with the sea consciousness that creates the zone of anomalies, or the Soviet Union that created the zone of radiation, both of which were in risk of becoming global catastrophes. For this reason, as we said before, the ecologists are the true alternative to the monolith. At this point, it's worth adding one more thing. Just as in the book we see Redrick working in coordination with scientists, the game similarly shows that the breakthrough to the center of the zone and overcoming its many obstacles only comes through the cooperation of Strelok and his team with scientific institutions. Only the unity of thought and action makes such a breakthrough possible, and once again we hear the faint echo of that restrained optimism from the films mentioned earlier, this time affirming that no mechanism of control can truly overpower human curiosity and skepticism. Thus, the noosphere as a network of thinking agents overcomes the noosphere as a collection of centralized thoughts. The mind is a blessing, but only when it does not overestimate its own capacities. In the end, we are left with the monolith as a point of catastrophe, the creation of the Lightbringers who, in the arrogance of their exceptional giftedness, dreaming of higher planes or a better future, set out on a path of centralization, efficiency, and streamlined decision-making, forgetting that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. With this, we come to the end of this exposition. The sentiment that ultimately prevails in the game, it seems to me, is the one that insists liberation is not found in escape, whether by dissolving into an ideological mantra or by rejecting consciousness, but in understanding. Though the price is steep, manifesting as self-questioning, backtracking, suffering, alienation, or disintegration, reflective consciousness remains a blessing of our species, one we cannot afford to abandon lightly. And yet, we must remain aware of its limitations, as well as the unique dangers that arise from the unique nature of this instrument nature has bestowed upon us. To borrow the words of Teilhard de Chardin, here again we find that light reflected on itself, glancing off and in a flash descending to the lowest frontiers of the past. But this time, what its beam illuminates in us at our lowest stages is no longer an endless play of tangled verticils, but a long sequence of discoveries. In the same beam of light, the instinctive gropings of the first cell link up with the learned gropings of our laboratories. So let us bow our heads with respect to the anxieties and joys of trying all and discovering all. The passing wave that we can feel was not formed in ourselves. It comes to us from far away. It set out at the same time as the light from the first stars. It reaches us after creating everything on the way. The spirit of research and conquest is the permanent soul of evolution. Naturally, the fundamental need of reflective consciousness is meaning, yet the search for it carries a paradox, as both the book and the game make clear. In truth, the quest for answer entails both the pushing of boundaries and exposure to uncharted terrain. The former may illuminate the questions we began with, but inevitably opens up many more. The latter, however, involves risking one's very life, thereby potentially destroying the very phenomenon for which meaning is being sought. Perhaps the essence lies in the search itself, in the exaltation of discovery, and in the hope it carries. Yet we must remain aware that the horizon appears beautiful until we reach the point that defined it, only to find a new one ahead, while the place we came from now takes on a beauty that justified the journey we undertook. There is no end. Movement is constant. The enchantment of hope and nostalgia are unquenchable forces, but they carry the danger of overlooking everything that is here and now. Along this path, reflective consciousness, and its finest and most powerful instrument, knowledge and science, remains the torch of humanity. With all its flaws and virtues, it still echoes a cosmic height within us. Even though the black abyss of the universe remains elusive and incomprehensible, it holds potential, and the torches we carry are the only tools that allow our fumbling in the dark not to be entirely blind. Through their use, perhaps man rises beyond the role of a cog or a bolt by which life tests impermanence, along a path strewn with anomalies. Thank you for watching.